Hey guys, Uncle Unit here. Today's video is the full audiobook of the horror anthology Insomnis Volume 1, written by Lux Noctis. You can support Lux by checking out his book on Amazon, and if you enjoy Insomnis, you may also enjoy Stray. I own a copy myself, and I personally recommend it if you're looking for an unconventional, yet relatable story about werewolves. Also, consider leaving a review on Amazon if you enjoy Lux's work. Any feedback and support is very much appreciated. Without any further delay, enjoy the video. Insomnis Volume 1, written by Lux Noctis, cover art by Ryan House, narrated by Unit 522, featuring Josei Kage and Lena Purtu. Icebound. Curious things seem to occur in the farthest corners of the world, leagues away from the towering spires and the man-made monsters, born of fire and steel. In distant lands there lie locations that seem somehow disconnected from the realm you know. Mystery still pervades, unmarred by modern life. The tale I tell you now is one pieced together from traveling whispers, for those who know it are reluctant to tell. The scene for this story lies far to the north, farther than anyone of sound body and mind would ever have the cause to travel. It is a barren land, one almost entirely devoid of life, for little could survive in its icy wastes. The rising peaks and bitter ocean make it appear almost alien in nature, and so its days follow suit. Unlike elsewhere, the sun remains hanging defiantly in the sky for weeks at a time. When light finally does fade, however, it makes room for the moon to reign, bathing the snow in near perpetual night. The dark time was approaching. A man wandered alone, ascending towards a treacherous peak. This man was named John, and he climbed for the sport of it, relishing the challenge. The few others that lived in his small fishing settlement were content to sit fireside in their free time, rather than face the brutality of the elements. Spiteful winds lashed at his weathered face, sending white powder soaring. All he could do was smirk in return. Frozen air burned his lungs with every breath, and it made him feel alive. He swung his ice pick heavily, anchoring to the snowy earth, and dragging himself upward. As he glanced over his shoulder, he could just barely glimpse the silhouette of his village through the snowdrift. His journey had barely begun, and he felt comfort in being close to home. This comfort was short-lived, however. For a couple more arduous steps skywards, his exhilaration turned to fear. His eyes widened as the telltale cracking, barely audible over the howling wind, gave way to a deafening crack as the ice beneath him shattered. He fell headlong into blackness, colliding painfully with coarse, unyielding walls. John's descent was rapid. Blindly he tumbled, and every hit he took reverberated around him. Then, silence. A momentary freefall before he came to a sudden stop to the sound of shattering bone. His pained wail echoed loudly, and for an instant he was deafened by it. He struggled through the agony to hold on to consciousness. John freed himself from his heavy pack, rolled onto his back, and lay on solid ground. The spot of light above him seemed distant as he clutched his broken wrist. He breathed heavily, trying to calm himself as his body shook, fueled by a concoction of pain and adrenaline. Gradually his ragged respiration slowed, and tense muscles began to relax. John lifted himself from the ground, trying to remain stoic in the face of adversity. He refused to let fear overwhelm his senses, and was careful to avoid applying pressure to his splintered bone. Quickly, he came to the realization that it would be impossible for him to climb to freedom with his broken arm. He called for help, knowing that his cries would go unanswered, drowned out by the screeching winds above. With a wince of discomfort, John twisted and used his working hand to retrieve a torch from his backpack. Its light sprang to life with a soft click, illuminating the glassy walls. He scoured their surface, praying for a way out. The light fell upon a hole in the ice. He shuffled over, finding that the opening was barely big enough to squeeze through, but it was possible. He had to make a choice, whether to sit and hope for rescue, or to try his luck. John wasn't the sort to sit idle and wait to die. He retrieved his pick, which had taken the fall far more gracefully than he had. Using a bungee cord, he hooked his backpack to the loop in his belt. It trailed behind him as he inched his way inside the tunnel's entrance. Even with the flashlight, there was no end in sight. John could only stop and glance periodically before returning to his agonizing crawl. He cursed his good-for-nothing wrist and groaned in response to his aching back and increasingly sore knees. Determined, he pressed on. The low temperature birthed a worrying lack of feeling in his limbs as the walls began to narrow around him. The ground became slick, and John struggled to keep traction, sliding forward against his will. He attempted to halt his descent, but to no avail. The tunnel became too steep. John picked up speed. The torch slipped from his hand, and he plunged into darkness once more. Breathless, he hurtled out of control, blindly caught in a dizzying decline. In an instant, the earth disappeared from beneath him, and he was forced to endure another crippling fall. The intrepid climber hit the snow with a thud, pack still in tow. The rattling torch followed him, creating its own impression in white powder. Flakes on his skin turned to water, making his trembling hands damp. The broken wrist pulsed as he clutched it defensively, gritting his teeth against the pain. Regaining his bearings, he sat up. A shaft of light pierced the darkness. A distant sound, like that of static, caught his attention. John hauled himself to his feet and dragged his battered body and his belongings towards the vital light source. Flashlight in hand again, he could finally sling the rucksack back over his shoulder and examine his surroundings. He was in a hollow, one seemingly carved from the ice itself. Untouched snow creaked beneath his feet as he cautiously explored. The body of the cave shimmered with watery brilliance, giving the appearance of being forever in motion. Vast pointed icicles hung ominously overhead, threatening to fall at the slightest disturbance. His boots splashed in a previously unseen stream, flowing silently at his feet. The distant hiss was steadily building in intensity with every step taken. It was then that John saw something that he was not expecting to see, something that made his stomach knot and his heart miss a single beat. The torchlight had fallen upon a woman, dressed in rags and encased within the glistening wall. Her bright green eyes glowed fiercely from within her frosty prison. John approached, struck by her magnificence. Instantaneously he became enamored with her graceful form. She was encapsulated within a tomb of perfect clarity, and to him this seemed a crime most heinous. He placed a damp palm on the ice, matching it with her own raised hand. The surface felt warm to the touch. Her mouth appeared trapped in the midst of a beautiful melody, and he wished more than anything that he could hear that sweet sound. John grabbed his hefty ice pick, and with all the force he could muster, he swung it at the glimmering wall. It bounced off with a pathetic click, jarring his good arm in the process. He tried again regardless, swinging repeatedly, attempting to free the frozen beauty, but to no avail. The battered explorer sighed. His heart grew heavy. With all his strength, he hadn't managed to make a single scratch. He dropped to his knees and stared, for who knows how long, craving her freedom. The flashlight began to flicker. Its power was getting low. However reluctant he was to leave, John knew that if the light died, he would be stranded, and worse yet, he would no longer be able to gaze upon the icebound maiden. With a final lingering look under a flickering beam, he turned on his heel, beginning his search for an exit. He headed for the static sound, wandering through winding pathways as the light gradually died. His mind never strayed too far from thoughts of the mysterious girl, even as the torch grew worryingly dim. The sound he chased became progressively louder, turning from a hiss to a low rumble, then rising to a deafening roar. He spotted a silvery glow, that of a bright moon, and knew that he had found his way out. John staggered towards the narrow mouth of the cave, and crossed the threshold to find himself beneath a starry sky, caught in the spray of a thunderous waterfall. Pangs of hunger twisted his gut, It dawned on him that he must have been in that place for hours. Trudging through the snow, he shivered violently. Heavily fatigued, he was relieved to soon see the lights of his humble home in the near distance. This was not the end. John became infatuated with the Hollow and the mystifying woman trapped within. Even when the near-endless night began, he still traveled back there again and again to see her. His strange behavior did not go unnoticed by the others in his settlement. Tall tales emerged in an attempt to explain why John had turned from a personable member of their community into a recluse. Every blackened day, he would emerge from his home to a chorus of whispers and disappear for hours at a time, only reappearing to sleep before the cycle started anew. All their theories were incorrect, however, for only he knew the truth. John didn't need the others, for he had his fair maiden. His attempts to free her were fruitless, but relentlessly he continued to try. The impossibly warm ice kept him from freezing during his extended visits, and he felt it near impossible to pry himself away when the time came to rest. Her prison seemed impenetrable, but the fisherman spoke constant reassurance. He would not cease until they were together, he would say, holding his hand against hers, soaking up her soothing heat. The fair one's face remained static, but he knew that she believed him. They were meant to be together. Over time he became frustrated, attacking the wall with as much brutality as he could produce, disregarding his bound and broken wrist. Still he made no impact. He roared in fury, and asked the girl a question. "What must I do? What will it take to set you free?" He pressed his ear to the slick surface, and after listening closely, his pupils expanded. Smiling, he told her that he understood, promised her that he would make it so. One was not enough to free her. First, he asked a single man to follow him to the cave. Bewildered, but curious to get to the bottom of John's strange behavior, he agreed, and immediately, he too became captivated by her. This pattern continued over the next 11 days. Each man who followed John to the imprisoned beauty refused to speak of what they had witnessed, but everyone convinced the next to join him in experiencing it for themselves. Those out of the loop, particularly the women, demanded to know what was going on. Unsettled by the unusual happenings, none would tell. On the final day, 12 men fought to breach the frozen cell, but it was hopeless. Disheartened by this, each became aggravated just as John had in the beginning. However, only John knew the truth of what had to be done. No one could have heard what took place within those walls, all sound buried beneath the roaring waters of the fall outside. Once it was done, John stood alone, bloody ice pick in hand. Motionless shapes littered the ground around him. 12 warm hearts lay on the snow at the feet of the fair maiden, staining it a most glorious shade of red. "My love, I have done what I had to do. Now you can be free," John said with gleeful excitement. Nothing seemed to change. The beauty bound in rags remained unmoving. Still stuck in the middle of her magnificent melody, he pressed his ear to the ice again, for one final time. His expression became a small, content smirk. He kissed her as best he could, mere inches away from razor-sharp fangs. "I understand," he whispered, never seeing the shadows that shared her frosty prison. "The final heart shall be my own. For you, my darling. No, for us," he stated, with a tone of wonder. It is said that as the pick pierced John's heart, a single crack appeared in the impenetrable frost. I cannot confirm this, for when I traveled to that fishing village myself, all who reside there refused to converse with me. Perhaps this is all just make-believe, hearsay, and superstition. After all, no one can say what happened for sure. It could all be naught but fiction. What I can tell you is this, though, my friends. I found no beguiling beauty encased within the walls of that place, and there were no hearts piled upon the ground. All I found is this: 13 frozen corpses, chests wide open, and an immeasurable pile of shattered ice. Smile. I never wanted to move to this town. My relocation was the result of a father fleeing his cheating wife. That whore was no mother of mine. I was forced to leave my friends, my school, hell, my whole life behind. Isn't it amazing how your whole world can come crashing down around you? How the life you've taken so long to build can be torn apart in mere moments? I left a bustling city, full of life, the kind of place that never sleeps. And where do I end up? In a place seemingly stuck in a perpetual coma. Don't worry, you'll get used to it, my father told me. Apparently, at 14 years old, I was adaptable, malleable to change, whether I realized it or not. It's a shame the same can't be said for a man of 43. A mere 6 months was all it took for the memories, for his doubts, and his lack of direction to get the better of him. It appeared his wrists were the peak of his adaptability, as they took to being open quite readily. I found him, of course, bathed in a basin of crimson liquid, blade by his side. The note he left me told me that everything would be fine, to keep smiling. It's easier said than done, when you're abandoned by your only faithful parent. He was gone. This meant that Lucy, the lady that drove my dad to destruction, had to come back into the picture. I told everyone that I'd be fine, that I'd rather go into care than live with her and her latest boyfriend. But she insisted on being there for her only son in his time of need. I refused to move. Yeah, I hated the sleepy streets I was forced to call home, but I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of getting her own way. It did me no favors. Turns out that because my parents were still married, the house belonged to her, so they both moved in, her and the homewrecker, into the very house where my father took his own life. His demise, a result of her salacious ways. The new man, William, resented me so. He had been forced to quit his job, leave his old home, who knows, maybe even his mistress. Giving him a taste of the medicine that I'd had to stomach was the only thing that gave my existence the smallest hint of gleeful pleasure. Having to live with them sent me on a downward spiral. Hatred built up until it leaked from every pore. School was a monotonous blur, and the faceless students meant nothing to me there. I didn't need anyone. Sleep never came easily. I spent my whole life in a never-ending daze, spitting venomous words at anyone who dared to question me. I was given a wide berth, allowed the isolation I desired, except for the one place I needed it most, at home. A year passed. My pregnant mother grew tired of my endless darkened mood. A 15-year-old boy should be happy, out playing with his friends, and experiencing the world. Or so she said. I told her to mind her own damn business, but true to form, she failed to take my request into account. The harlot dragged me to a doctor. She even wept in the whitecoat's office. Crystal crocodile tears. Lucy was claiming that she didn't know what to do with me, that I wasn't healthy and I needed help. I glared at her swollen gut, wondering briefly just whose seed she was carrying. The doc had just the thing, the perfect solution to all of my worldly problems. How terribly convenient. He grinned wide as he handed me the pills. "Don't you worry, son. These will put a smile on your face in no time," he assured me in his bedside manner tone. 2 in the morning, 2 at night. Those were the instructions he gave. They would balance me out, I overheard him say in a hushed voice. Depression is common amongst youngsters, but remember, things might get worse before they get better. On the first night, she watched me take them, making sure I did exactly as the doctor ordered. I swallowed them willingly, assuming it couldn't make things any worse. Synthetic happiness is preferable to no happiness at all. Uncharacteristically, I fell into a deep sleep. I wandered through the darkness. My footsteps echoed in empty space.
After the longest time, lost in black, a figure emerged in the distance, standing statuesque. I approached the unknown. Reaching the shrouded creature, I stood in silence. Its head was bowed beneath an obsidian hood, face obscured. I reached out to reveal it. Before I could touch the mysterious form, a gaunt, clawed hand struck. I awoke in a cold sweat. Something about the hooded thing made me uneasy. It was just a nightmare, I told myself. Everybody gets those. Under a watchful gaze, I took the pills again. 2 in the morning, 2 at night. The blackness returned. A familiar silhouette lay ahead. My heart raced, as fear consumed what little courage I can claim to possess. It seems so pointless now, to be afraid. Back then, I was naive. I didn't understand, so I ran, sprinting as hard as I could in the opposite direction, through the sea of infinite shade. My heart burned with each acidic breath. But it was all for nothing. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was a little closer, then closer still. I stumbled and fell. The last thing I remembered was a flash of bone-white flesh. The following day, I refused to take my meds. I didn't want the nightmares anymore. I truly thought he meant me harm. That was when I discovered that William wasn't afraid to use force to get his way. He pinned my body to the floor, whilst Lucy force-fed me the pills. I was overwhelmed by a choking sensation, as I did my utmost to reject the medicine. I kicked, I scratched. I even sunk my teeth into his exposed skin. But he refused to release me until I had swallowed the capsules. The whole ordeal was repeated later that night. The same shortness of breath, the powerless feeling of having my freedom taken away. I did my best to stay awake, but that stuff kept me drowsy. I couldn't fight off sleep like I used to, and soon I fell once more into the abyss. There he was again, in the distance. This time, he beckoned me forth with a slender, pale finger. My instinct to run overtook my willingness to obey, and fruitlessly I took off again. The same pattern repeated. Even then, I knew it was hopeless. The creature kept getting closer. I stopped and turned to face it. It remained in place like it always seemed to. Cautiously, I edged my way towards it, unsettled by its perfect stillness. I stayed out of reach of its gnarled hands. Suddenly his arm burst forth. I stumbled back in a pathetic display of terror. In his grasp was a tattered piece of paper. He held it out into space, waiting patiently. I slowly crept back to my feet. Panic began to take hold, but I fought to bury it. The claws around the ragged letter looked menacing, so I snatched the sheet as quickly as I could, never taking my eyes off of the bowed head of the thing in front of me. I unfolded the letter hesitantly, and scrawled upon it in a coppery hue were the words,
"You really need to smile more."
Upon reading them, I looked back at the hooded messenger. He raised his head, revealing his pale face for the first time. Deep scars ran from his lips to his ears, and he shared with me an ever-present grin. Thick red stitches stretched in elegant crosses over his wonderful smirk. The messenger wore a blindfold, truly embracing the darkness of his world. But it was then that I finally realized that it was I who had failed to see. He wasn't a monster who meant me harm. Really, he just wanted a friend. I just wanted a friend too. From then on, I took the pills willingly, and spent each and every night visiting my newfound companion. He was always so joyful, and it was utterly infectious. We conversed in whispers. I told him everything, and he kept all my secrets. Things started to get better. I wasn't so unhappy anymore. My little sister Grace was born, dragged kicking and screaming into the world, and bearing witness to the miracle of life made me appreciate my own all the more. I even convinced my new friend to come with me outside of the dark place. Soon he was always there for me, keeping me company. I even began to excel in school. He watched me work from gloomy corners, as teachers praised me for being ever so intelligent. When I was around the house, he always looked out for me. He would make sure nothing bad ever happened. The drowsiness my medication had caused me in the beginning seemed to dissipate over time. I'm sure that was his doing too, because he cared. Really, he did. We were constantly together, completely inseparable, and life was perfect. We reached the day of my 16th birthday. Everything seemed fine in the beginning. I took my pills like as always. He was there as I opened my gifts, and all was well. That evening, though, things took a sudden turn. I was sat in my room with my friend, bathed in his comforting shadow, when I heard the shouting downstairs. We both went down to investigate, because we do everything together. We hid behind the kitchen door and listened to Mom and Will arguing. I don't know what a placebo is, but Will was screaming about how by now I really shouldn't need one. Mom was disagreeing, telling him that it was all that was keeping me happy. I know that wasn't true. It was my friend that was keeping me happy, of course. Their dispute continued, and eventually, it wasn't just about me anymore. I heard Will hit Mom, because he's not afraid to use force. She sounded upset, so I peeked through the crack in the door. Dark streaks ran down her face, and she looked very sad. Gracie sat wailing in her high chair. I wondered why. Why was everyone so miserable? Was it because of me? This thought made me miserable too. I didn't want to make anyone unhappy. I wore a frown that I hadn't had to wear for a long time. But my friend kept his grin, knowing we could make things better. He whispered, reminding me that I should smile more. And then, I knew exactly what to do. I rushed back up to my room, excited about making everybody happy again. I went to my bed and crawled underneath it, through the dust, all the way to the back. No one knew that I kept my father's knife. I didn't let anyone know, apart from my friend, because he's the only one that I could trust. I pulled the piece of wood away from the wall, and the blade was hidden behind it. It still had stuff on it. The screaming beneath my feet continued. So I told my friend they just had to hold on a little longer. I would make it all fine. I had to go into the bathroom first to make sure I got my smile just right. I did it very well. I made it look just like his. Then I went downstairs, and I made everybody else happy with me. Mommy and Will, even little Gracie is smiling now. I felt very good about it, and I knew that I'd never be sad again. My friend told me that I had done well, and he said not to worry. With our help, the whole town will be smiling soon. Within the walls. Alistair stared intently at the oil-painted crow. It hung from the wall in its dusty olive frame. The bird's likeness had been rendered so perfectly, its feathers seemed to capture light from an unseen source beyond the scope of the image. Its beady eye stared back at him. So lifelike was its approximation that, for a second, he could have sworn he saw it move. A sudden loud ring broke the bird's hold over him. It was the bell on the counter. The two guests that stood in front of it came into focus.
"Aren't you forgetting something?"
A portly woman asked him. Her dangerously slender husband with a gray pencil mustache stood meekly at her side. Alistair gaped blankly, seemingly unable to grasp the meaning of the words.
"Our room key."
The lady smiled in a good-natured manner. Her American accent softened each element in her sentence, every syllable flowing smoothly into the next. "Oh, of course," Alistair replied, the gears in his mind finally beginning to turn. His Scottish twang contrasted starkly with his customer's sweeping sounds. He tugged open a dark oak drawer and began rummaging through the sets of keys. A hand fell upon the key to room 7. "I've decided to upgrade you to our finest room, Mr. and Mrs. Cook, at no extra charge, of course." Alistair's soft, weather-beaten face stretched into a smile. Mr. Cook flinched as his wife squeaked gleefully.
Well, that's just wonderful. I can't wait to go check it out.
Mrs. Cook snatched the key away from the Scotsman's doughy palm.
Come on, George.
She said, jabbing her husband in the ribs with her elbow. He immediately grabbed their suitcases. "Would you two like a hand with those?" Alistair asked, looking a little concerned for George's safety.
No, we're fine,
Sylvia Cook stated, waving her flabby arm dismissively. She headed up the stairs. Her skeletal husband trembled beneath the weight of his cargo. He shot Alistair a look that told him poor George might have just considered death a merciful alternative. The ancient staircase creaked uneasily as the frail old man struggled his way up the mountainous flight. After an uncomfortably long time, he finally disappeared from view. Alistair smirked to himself. Manners had kept his face stern, right up until the guests had left his presence. The smirk swiftly turned into a frown when he considered the fact that the Cooks were his only guests. Business had been incredibly slow, and it was gradually bleeding him dry. He sighed wearily to himself, glancing around the entrance to his guest house. It was his pride and joy, but it had fallen into a somewhat sorry state. As Alistair mused, his ear picked up a faint melody coming from the room behind him. He stepped through into a shambles of an office. It looked as though it had been frozen in time many years ago. The whole building was seemingly stuck in the past. Battered old guest books, full of the signatures of previous customers, were spread haphazardly on shelving, tables, and floors alike. Gas lighting cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls. As he strode across the ancient floorboards, they strained beneath his weight. The haunting melody grew louder as he approached the sturdy door to the storage closet. He turned the black iron key that was always left in the lock. He inched the door open, and the music became clear as day. Sat atop the pile of long-forgotten coats left by guests who had never returned for them, the music box stood. The headless dancer twirled infinitely, bathed in shadow, moving to her never-ending melody. He ducked low and reached inside, removing the old box as a pang of sorrow struck his heart. The music box had belonged to his wife. He hadn't seen the thing for well over a year. Hadn't heard that music since before the illness took her from him. The box's incessant chime only brought him pain. He snapped it shut and ran a worn-out hand across the gold vines embedded in its ebony surface. A sudden thump startled him, coming from the closet. He poked his head back inside curiously. Nothing. Then, the sound of movement to his left, and the soft crackle of falling debris. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall. Alistair placed his palm on the cold stone and traced his touch along where the noise seemed to originate. Whatever it was seemed to notice his presence, then darted furiously away. The room was finally silent once more. The Gentile Scotsman wondered what it could have been. He considered a terrifying notion. Rats. That was the last thing he needed with things going the way they were. He groaned to himself and hoped it would be nothing quite so sinister. His thoughts returned to the box, and how it had gotten to be where it was. And stranger yet, how had it been opened? Even this thought was quickly replaced by a deep emptiness. He slumped in a rickety chair, dropped his head into his hands, and allowed himself to wallow in misery. She was never coming back. Alistair's sleep was restless. He was plagued by memories that made drifting deeper into dreams impossible. Every blink seemed to throw him forward in time, yet he felt like he hadn't switched off for a single moment. His eyes flew open as dust caught in his throat, causing him to cough and sputter uncontrollably. Moonlight, just enough to see by, filtered through his grimy window pane. Its beams highlighted the falling matter. The ceiling above him seemed to groan. A tiny crack formed in the paintwork above his head. As the low creak moved, the crack spread along with it. The gaslight hanging above shuddered, causing the glass to cling noisily. Alistair leapt from his bed, his pale and sagging body jerking into motion. He followed the sounds above, keeping his eyes fixed high. It passed out into the hallway. Momentarily, he considered returning to the relative comfort beneath the covers, shutting his eyes and leaving the mysterious happening unsolved. He could not, though. Before he could willingly make a decision, his hand was on the door's cold brass handle. Something was pulling him forward, an invisible and immeasurable force. He pushed the door open. It whined in protest. His feet touched down on the musty carpet of the second-floor hallway. With each muted step down the darkened corridor, a familiar melody seemed to rise. He passed closed-off and empty rooms, and felt remarkably alone. A dim light flickered ahead of him, creeping through the tiny gap between the door and its frame at the end of the hall. He longed to stop, to turn around and retreat to the safety of his bed. However, with each timid stride, the melody grew louder still, and his power to resist diminished ever further. As he reached the door, Alistair's heart thundered in his chest. Incapable of turning away, he attempted to peek through the opening. He could see nothing. Before he had the chance to think, he found himself pushing his way inside. A flickering candle was the source of light, and before it in the claustrophobic room stood a slender woman, dressed all in white. The face reflected in the bathroom mirror made his blood run cold. It was his wife, eyes closed, the very picture of serenity. The door behind him slammed shut. "Maria?" Alistair spoke softly. Innumerable copies of Maria's silhouette seemed to twist and twirl on the walls around him. The figure did not respond. Alistair's mouth became as dry as old bone. His bare body shivered in the icy cold. Breath turned into frost in the air as he exhaled. He reached forward with a trembling hand, his eyes never leaving the motionless face of his former love reflected back at him. She looked so much younger than she had in her final years. Her stillness reminded him of an open casket. His outstretched fingers were less than an inch from her. Then it happened. All at once, a deafening low-pitched drone drowned out the moving chimes. The eyelids of the static figure peeled back, and the mouth opened wide. Viscous black tar poured from each orifice in congealed lumps. Alistair stumbled backwards and fell leaden upon the tiled ground. The candle flickered, shifting the whole room momentarily into an impenetrable darkness. The face was upon him then, staring right at his own. He cried out, but it was impossible to hear over the deep thrum of the noise that enveloped all others. He felt the vile, rancid substance fall upon his exposed skin. The bathroom door swung open, and in the same instant, the candle ceased to burn. A wiry man stood, clutching a candle of his own. "Are you all right down there?" Mr. Cook croaked, his wrinkles deepened by the flickering flame. When the sun arose, its light was smothered by a thick and heavy fog. Alistair hadn't gotten a wink of sleep since the incident in the bathroom. He talked himself into believing that it was a night terror, some kind of delusion, nothing of substance. Through bleary eyes, he dropped a fresh egg into a hot pan. "You damn near gave me a heart attack last night," George chuckled in good humor. "Prone to sleepwalking?" "Aye, it's not unheard of." "Well, at least I know that now. If I run into you in the halls again tonight, it'll be less of a shock. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the whole historical vibe you got going on here, but I'll be damned if it don't make things a little unsettling when night comes around," George croaked. You get used to it, and besides, you'll struggle to find another place like this anywhere in the world," Alistair replied, in a weary attempt to keep the conversation flowing. "Well, that's for certain." George smiled, and then paused for a beat. "Don't suppose I could trouble you for some bacon with those eggs, could I?" "It would be my pleasure." The owner of the grand guest house gave a quick nod. The hungry old man offered a soft pat on the shoulder in appreciation, then swiftly left the kitchen. Alistair prodded at the eggs absent-mindedly. The sound was like static. Fat splattered his yellowing apron as he lit another of the stove's gas hobs and placed a fresh pan upon it. He added a splash of oil, and a loud hiss filled the room. He stepped over to the icebox to retrieve the cuts of meat his guests had requested. As the box opened, a single musical note seemed to ring out. Alistair leaped back in horror. He collided with a towering shelf, sending decorative glassware tumbling to the ground. He approached the box again, against his better judgment. When he peered inside, masses of writhing flesh squirmed upon the ice. They were colored with deep reds and putrid, infected-looking yellows. Bile rose in his throat, and the stench of death overwhelmed his senses. "Is everything all right in there?" George yelled, sounding concerned as he approached. Alistair slammed the lid of the icebox closed as the old man entered. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just a little accident-prone today, it would seem." Alistair glanced over his shoulder. Still crouched by the icebox, he could hear the wiggling monstrosities within. He prayed that George could not. "Jesus, you really did a number on these, huh?" George mumbled, eyeing the shattered glass spread across the kitchen floor. "I'll help you clean this up." No, it's quite all right." Alistair stood. "My mess. I'll clean it up." He sighed as he retrieved an ancient-looking dustpan and brush from under the sink. "Well, at least let me give you a hand with the breakfast." George reached for the icebox. "No, don't you, Alistair began, but it was too late. "Honestly, it's no trouble. You need to relax a little, my friend. I can whip up bacon with the best of 'em, I assure you." George held the frozen bacon aloft and winked. The crow's feet around his eyes momentarily became deepest chasms. With that, the safety of the day seemed to dissipate. Alistair began to consider the notion that he might be losing his grip on reality. He needed rest. Surely that would be the cure. But something would not let him sleep. Over the following days, he continued to hear the scuttling feet from within the walls, to see things that he was certain could not be. As sleepless night followed sleepless night, the world itself seemed to take on a warped, twisted quality. The sense of the surreal began to permeate the old guest house, still isolated by the dense fog. To Alistair, the walls were in a perpetual motion, fluid, like the rippling of gentle waves, lapping silently at icy shores. All sound became distant, as though he were drowning beneath the surface of that same frigid water. All that is, except for the music, which seemed to haunt him whenever he tried to snatch a moment of respite. The instant he closed his eyes, the music would return, and along with it came paranoia. His guests noticed nothing out of the ordinary. They went about their business, occasionally disappearing for a few hours, becoming hazy, distorted figures as they disappeared into the mist. It was in these moments that Alistair felt at his most vulnerable, and he feared that what lurked within the walls might smell his weakness, might taste his fear in the air. After 5 days, he was convinced something was stalking him, and whatever it was, it had to be the cause of his misery. Alistair was alone, and a daze he wiped down the front desk with a dirty rag. It felt soft and pliable. What he knew was solid wood seemed to give beneath his hand. It had been 6 days since he had gotten any sleep. The grainy surface appeared to twist and tangle itself between his outstretched fingers. He clumsily snatched his hand away from the dark oaken tendrils. His eyes watched them retreat, but saw little. The sound of a cawing crow inflamed his otherwise dull senses. He spun around and stared blearily at his beloved oil painting. The crow's unblinking eye stared back. Alistair struggled to focus, mouth hanging open vacantly. Every blink seemed to diminish his already muddy view. He staggered forward and clutched the painting's frame. Soot-like dust clung to his palms. He squinted at the bird on the canvas. For a second, the image became clear. The bird's head jerked towards him. All at once, the malicious melody burst into existence again, this time at an ear-shattering volume, and countless shadowy crows flew from the canvas in a torrent of black feathers. Alistair was thrown off his feet. He crashed painfully on his aged hip. The birds dived towards the ground and, instead of colliding with it, seemed to be absorbed by it. They combined, becoming an inky black mass that spread outwards, growing as though organic. From the pool of darkness, the music box arose. The headless dancer twirled, and from beneath her delicate feet, vines began to grow. From them sprouted golden leaves. They clung to every surface, taking root where they could. Alistair leapt to his feet and rushed towards the cupboard under the staircase, where old tools were stored, long since retired from use. He tugged open the door violently and grabbed the closest thing to hand, a grubby sledgehammer. His soft hands gripped the handle with purpose as his eyes fell upon the music box, the trinket his wife had held so dear. Alistair lunged toward it, raising the hammer high above his head. He swung it down with all the force his weary bones could produce. The box shattered, and the room fell silent. The vines had ceased their expansion. The dancer no longer twirled, and the branch in the painting was now without a resident. The sound of labored breathing was all that could be heard, until the telltale scuttling from behind the bricks began anew.
"You bastard! Not this time!"
Alistair cried out, enraged. He swung the sledgehammer again, aiming for what moved behind the brickwork. Each thunderous blow left a fresh hole in the stone of the old guest house. Each one seemed to be a fraction too late to stop the unseen creature. He chased the sound up the stairs and to the second-floor hallway. As he tore through the building, the doors of the rooms around him receded, disappeared as if they were never there, until only one remained, the door to room 7. He could hear the thing moving somewhere in the space beyond it. The hallway as he had known it was gone. It had morphed into a sterile white box-like room. He rattled the handle aggressively, but the door would not budge.
"I've got you now, you little fuck!"
he bellowed, sending stringy saliva spilling down his chin. Wheezing, he began to swing his hammer at the entrance to room 7. The repeated strikes made his palms numb, but he refused to stop. Finally, a split appeared in the wood. Then, with another strike, the door began to splinter. Alistair cast the hammer aside and furiously hurled himself at the barricade that stood in his way. It gave in, and he tumbled through, landing face down on the moist, pulsating ground. As Alistair raised himself from the floor, foul-smelling mucus-like fluid clung to every part of him. The 4 walls that surrounded him were made of a familiar sickly flesh, with bloody crimsons and fatty yellows. Light gradually disappeared, as the disgusting tissue expanded over the opening through which he had fallen, plunging him into darkness. For a few agonizing seconds, all was quiet, then an ear-splitting shriek as countless candles sprung to life. What appeared in the glow of the flickering flames was a distorted and broken thing. It wept loudly at the room's center, shrill cries of anguish and torment. Countless clear tubes sprouted from its back, and through them flowed glutinous biological liquid. The monster's mouth was covered, wrapped in skin that formed a hose. The hose hung down loosely, and then ran up into the blackness above. Its eyes leaked an obsidian fluid, and yet it looked disturbingly human. It clutched the fragments of the broken music box. Alistair fell to his knees. Tears he could not understand broke free, echoing the unimaginable sorrow that overwhelmed him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the grotesque being in front of him. He sobbed uncontrollably. "Forgive me," he pleaded, with hands clasped tightly together. It screamed out for a final time, with such force that it could have split the very sky itself. Suddenly the candle ceased to be. A bright light blinded Alistair. The doorway had reappeared. George and Sylvia Cook stood in front of him. The sledgehammer was back in his hands. "Hey, Ellie, what are you do?" But then his words morphed and became an unbearably deep and troubling drone.
No, stop!
Alistair cried, burying his head. But it was lost to that all-encompassing sound. The foundations themselves seemed to shake beneath his feet. George's arm began to blister. Then the blisters grew and merged, forming a raw-looking red lump. More blisters began to rise, this time on his face. They, too, grew to grotesque proportions, until he barely looked human at all. The strange phenomenon then spread to his wife.
You're a part of this! You both are a part of this!
The aging Scotsman yelled against the unstoppable noise. Tears still fell. He squeezed down hard on the hammer's handle and leapt towards the mutated creatures. Alistair ran through the dense fog, near sightless.
I have to hide. I have to hide. I need to be where it can't find me. I can never go back there. Never again.
He wheezed to himself as he forced one flabby leg in front of the other, in spite of his heart that threatened to burst. The guest house he once knew was far behind him, and all was silent, aside from his own shuddering breaths. A large form emerged from the void ahead of him. A farmhouse. He dashed up to the front door and slammed a gelatinous fist against it.
Hello? Is anyone in there?
He asked, breathless. No answer. He ran for the window, but it was shattered. Behind it there was no furniture, and no sign of life. Just an old house, left in ruins.
I can't hide here. It has walls. Walls with spaces behind them. Spaces for it to be. Spaces where it can get me.
He rambled, still panting. Then he set off slowly behind the house to continue his search. It was then that his sights fell upon a well that lay to the house's rear.
That is perfect. It has walls with no spaces. Nowhere for it to be.
Alistair smiled widely to himself in jubilation. He sprinted over to the well with something close to a spring in his step. It had a bucket with a rope and a crank to lower it down. It was impeccable. Elated, he wound the crane, lowering the bucket down into the deep well that would be his sanctuary. It settled in the shallow water at the bottom of the shaft. Alistair lifted himself onto the stone circle, muttering to himself the whole time.
I'll hide here until it stops looking. When it leaves, I'll be free. I can never go back to the house. Never go back there again. It knows there. It knows every inch of the place.
He took a firm hold of the rope, and with aching arms, he slowly lowered himself down. He reached the well's base with a faint splash. The freezing water came up to his knees. He gulped in great lumps of air and breathed a heavy sigh of relief.
It can't get me down here. I'm safe.
He chuckled to himself, beaming.
Down here I can sleep.
He lowered his soft body into the freezing water and leaned his head up against the damp stones behind him.
Yeah, down here I can finally sleep,
he mumbled, looking up at the hazy sky from his place below the ground. The silhouette of the rope swayed lazily to and fro, and then, with a soft click, it dropped. He watched it fall, felt the weight of the rope as it coiled up on top of him, becoming heavier as it absorbed the water. He grabbed a hold of it and held it aloft above his face, eyeing it carefully. Then he laughed. He laughed harder and longer than he had ever laughed before, reveling in the joy he felt, in the hilarity of the moment. The rope had fallen, and he could not care less. Alistair settled back down, still chuckling maniacally to himself. He got comfortable, and finally closed his eyes. The moment was serene. It was silent perfection, the purest bliss. In a flash, his eyes flew open again. His pupils grew large in the low light, as a familiar melody began to play. Incision.
No, I'm not gonna talk about this.
Came the aggravated whispers in the darkened room.
Don't waste your fucking breath.
Shadows swayed, guided by light escaping from the cell phone's blindingly bright screen. There was a moment of silence, but the darkness continued to dance excitedly to the rhythm of the half-heard conversation.
You don't get it, do you? I'm done.
The room was quiet again as the cell phone protested.
Don't bother. You're fucking dead to me.
With a short beep, the dance was done. The doctor released a heavy breath in the gloom, unsure of her next move. She fell leaden on the empty bed, one usually reserved for patients, and clutched a musty pillow, still not yet cold from its most recent occupant. She pressed it hard to her lips and stifled the most ferocious of screams. Something fell to the ground at her back with a soft click. She placed the pillow down and turned to see a disposable plastic cup twisting idly on the linoleum flooring, a small amount of liquid leaking from within. The sensation of being surveyed washed over her, then disappeared just as quickly as it had manifested when the phone began to flash once more. Dr. Williams immediately rejected the call and killed the troublesome device with a swift press of the power button. She stood tall and smoothed down her white coat, the one that demanded so much respect. In preparation, she murmured to herself, counting at a snail's pace from 5 to 1. Then, poise regained, she headed back out into the hospital's stagnant halls. The graveyard shift held a strange dichotomy for the staff at the St. Rose Medical Center. On the one hand, it meant a more manageable workload. Patients are far easier to care for when most of them are in deepest slumber, after all. On the other, those soundless corridors can lead to an unquiet mind. This is especially true when surrounded on all sides by the sick and the dying. With a concoction of silence and superstition comes paranoia. Could there ever be a more fitting place for restless souls to gather than the location where many of them met their end? This bizarre thinking meant that despite the reduced stress and increased pay of the twilight hours, most found them to be disagreeable and avoided them at all costs. Such groundless fears were not an issue for Mrs. Williams, soon to go by a different name, should she get her way. She would pay those childish ideas no mind, as a being ruled by logic. Education, in her eyes, was the cure to ignorance, and eliminating ignorance was key in her field. Every possibility must be analyzed and scrutinized methodically in order to ensure a correct diagnosis. In any case, it seemed to her that all the restless souls in her place of work were still planted firmly within their hosts. She could see the deepest tension in the faces of family members, anxiously waiting the inevitable passing of a loved one, watching their own flesh and blood fade to black before their eyes. The only ones to find peace at St. Rose were those for whom the curtain had already closed, naught but the living stir within its cold and clinical quarters. Working hard to maintain an air of stoicism, the good doctor made her rounds. It was more a token gesture than anything close to actual work, a thinly veiled attempt to gift the sleepless with some peace of mind, an indication that patients petrified of their various ailments were in the hands of qualified and experienced professionals, rather than having to rest all their hopes on a set of fresh scrubs. She did her utmost to quash the maelstrom of anger and angst that raged within her mind, keeping a steady bedside manner tone as she comforted those wallowing in anxiety. From room to room she stalked, flitting from harsh light into softest shade, footsteps reverberating through vacant space. Finally, she reached room 21, empty for all but one patient.
Good evening.
She greeted the elderly attendant, upturning her lips in her finest imitation of a sincere smile.
"Oh, hello there, Sarah,"
the frumpy old lady responded wearily. Insisting people address her on a first-name basis was a trust-building tactic. Engaging people on a personal level made them feel less like a statistic. Sarah flashed a quick, and she hoped, unnoticed glance at the chart at the end of the bed, to remind herself that the recovering heart attack's name was Layla Jennings.
How are you feeling tonight, Layla?
The doctor asked, observing the 5 empty beds that surrounded them. White sheets, all bathed in the ailing yellow glow of an aging bulb.
"Oh, I'm feeling much stronger now. Taking things one day at a time, you know.
She chuckled, but her creased brow betrayed her.
Well, I can assure you, Mrs. Jennings, you have nothing to worry about. Your condition is completely stable. It's normal to feel weak for an extended period following a cardiac episode. The very best thing you can do to aid your recovery is relax. I promise you, you're in safe hands here.
The skeletal doctor flashed pearly teeth at the heavy-set patient to punctuate her pre-prepared promises.
Oh, of course, of course. The staff here has been incredible. I trust you. It's just difficult not to feel a little fragile at a time like this.
The old one gave a short smirk in return for the white coat's toothy performance.
It's typical to feel delicate, but there's no need to worry. Let us do the worrying for you.
Sarah's delivery was sickeningly sweet.
You seem to be going from strength to strength. I think it's safe to say that it's all up from here, Layla.
She nodded, giving her own statement a reassuring seal of approval. Mrs. Cardiac episode seemed satisfied.
How are you doing being in this room alone? I hope you're comfortable with the solitude.
I'm fine with it. I never really feel alone in this room anyway, if I'm honest.
Mrs. Jennings replied heartily, pawing at her blue rents, revealing a cross-shaped scratch on her inner forearm.
What happened to your arm?
The doctor asked, bemused. The exhausted senior peered at the mark.
I hadn't even noticed that. Oh well, you pick up little cuts and grazes as you go, I suppose.
The patient shrugged, her act remaining upbeat. Dr. Williams considered this, and then bobbed her head in agreement.
Okay, well, try to get the rest you need, Mrs. Jennings. Remember that if you want anything at all, just hit that call button and someone will be right here to assist you.
Oh, of course, I'll do that. Thank you, Sarah.
The elderly woman responded sleepily.
Good night, Layla.
The doctor said as she hit the light switch, ridding the room of its hideous yellow haze. She didn't notice the eyes, the ones aiming a piercing stare at her back from the blackness, as she left Lila Jennings to her fate. No, she didn't spot them, but they were most certainly there, seen clear as day in the darkness. It was when exchanging hushed words with a cancer patient kept wide awake by chemo-induced sickness that Sarah Williams heard the commotion coming from a short way down the hall. All her efforts to remain near silent were dashed by the frantic cries emanating from her co-workers. She hurriedly excused herself from the conversation and rushed towards the building torrent of sound. A couple of hospital orderlies sprinted past her, carting a stretcher across the slick and shimmering ground.
We have to get her to the operating theater now. She's bleeding out.
A muffled voice called as the orderlies rounded the corner and barged their way into room 21. A dull thud resounded as the doctor reached the room, the sound of Mrs. Jennings being loaded onto her only hope of survival. For a moment, Sarah forgot all her troubles. The stress of providing for a child, her piece of shit husband, her lack of satisfaction with life. It all dispersed for a single instant as she watched the sweet old lady glide past her, eyes rolled and convulsing violently, throat open wide. Scarlet poured from her gaping wound, viscous arterial blood collecting on the trundling trolley, framing her face in shades of red.
My God, what happened?
Dr. Williams asked a shaken-looking nurse, who seemed to be turning paler by the second.
I don't know. I have no idea. She hit the call button a bunch of times, and then I get here and I find her like that.
The nurse's hands trembled as she fumbled her speech.
Could she have done that to herself?
The doctor sighed. She had no idea. It didn't seem like Mrs. Jennings was in the state of mind to take such self-destructive action. During the day, she was surrounded by a supportive family, a loving partner, and she appeared to be in relatively high spirits, even when alone at night. Certainly a worried patient, but the dithering old lady being suicidal seemed unlikely. The alternative was worse, however, so bleak it almost didn't bear thinking about. The thought that someone in the hospital, be it patient or staff, had wanted to kill a harmless old woman. Worryingly, it seemed to be the logical explanation. Lurking somewhere amongst them was a being cold and cruel, bearing both ill intentions and the malevolent manner to act upon them.
You should go to the staff room. Stay around other people. Wandering alone might be dangerous.
Sarah told the shivering nurse.
What? Why? What about you? What are you going to do?
The young girl clutched defensively at Sarah's arm as she frantically asked her questions.
I'm going down to reception. Something about this just feels wrong. I think we'll all be a lot safer once we get the police here. Do me a favor. Please make an effort to keep everybody calm.
As always, she tried to maintain her cool and collected demeanor. The nurse took a deep breath and agreed to do her best. Sarah took off, too headstrong to follow her own advice. Solitary, she marched a familiar route. Up ahead, the insufferable buzzing of a halogen light clinging desperately to life could be heard. It grew in intensity as she made her way towards the elevator. She refused to acknowledge the creeping sense of disquiet, refuting its existence before it had the chance to sway her iron will. Standing beneath the bothersome bulb, she hit the elevator call button. The arrow adorning the button sparked into life, glowing a luminous green. Intermittently, her reflection in the closed elevator doors morphed from self-assured medical professional into shaken silhouette. For a second she could swear she saw another, crouched low to the ground behind her. Dr. Williams' heart skipped uneasily, but when the luminescence returned, she was sharing a space with no one. Briefly, she entertained the notion that she wasn't so unlike the rest. Maybe she too could feel the groundless pang of superstition. The elevator's mirrored entrance spread slowly, like a carefully opened wound stretched wide after first incision. She stepped inside. The soles of her sturdy shoes created a tinny clang that reverberated all around her. Sarah hit the switch for the ground floor and stood at the steel box's center, glad to be on the move again. The contents of her stomach shifted as the elevator dropped. It swayed as it moved, and she swayed with it, numb during her brief reprieve from uncertainty. Suddenly the lights went out, and the floor beneath her jerked to a halt. Dr. Williams stumbled blindly backwards, connecting with the smooth walls. She clutched sightlessly at the railing that ran around her perimeter, and a sharp stabbing pain shot through her wrist. The elevator burst back into action as quickly as it had stopped. Warm liquid ran down the doctor's palm and dripped from between her fingers. At last, reaching her destination, the doors opened. She strode from the elevator, examining her leaking laceration, its finer details hidden beneath the thick fluid. That concern was momentary, though, her focus near instantly returning to the task at hand. There was an air of tension in the hospital's reception. The disorder had filtered its way through the ceiling above, and those few below could only sit and wonder what had set in motion the frantic cries and furious footsteps over their heads. The receptionist regarded the doctor with a nervous frown as she approached.
Dr. Williams, what the hell is going on up there?
The lady asked hoarsely.
There's been an incident. I think a patient was attacked in her room.
Sarah whispered in return, hoping to avoid causing the inevitable spread of panic that would soon grip the hospital, as word of the elderly lady's unfortunate evening traveled from ear to ear.
Jesus, what did they do? Do we know who could have done it?
The receptionist's eyes were agape, illustrating equal parts fear and morbid curiosity.
No, that's why we need to get the police down here now.
No, that's why we need to get the police down here now, before anything else happens and before this turns into a complete shitstorm. This place will go to hell if we don't act immediately.
The doctor's words were grave. She could not afford to understate the gravity of the situation. Sarah. A familiar smooth voice came from behind, and a burst of hatred and pain surged inside her.
Make the call,
Sarah said, leaning over the desk.
She then turned to face her husband, who stood looking downtrodden before her. He scratched at his graying hair nervously.
"Can we talk?"
The sharply dressed man that she used to call her own inquired.
I have nothing to say to you, Darren.
Dr. Williams hurled every syllable in his direction, each carrying the force of a well-aimed bullet. She turned on her heels and pushed her way through the heavy fireproof doors, disappearing down the hall. Sarah didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had no desire to speak with her spouse. Darren was the very concept of betrayal, made real and wrapped in an Armani suit.
"Sarah, wait, please!"
The Judas called from behind her, chasing her with hurried strides.
"I'm sorry, okay? I really am."
You're only sorry you got caught. Get your shit together. I want you gone before I get home.
She replied without breaking stride.
"Now hold on."
Darren grabbed her shoulder in frustration and pulled her forcefully into the nearest room. A shimmering collection of surgical tools and shelves lined with medical supplies surrounded them.
Don't ever lay your hands on me again.
The doctor glared.
"Look, I just want you to listen to reason. Hear me out. That's all I ask."
Darren begged as the lights flickered around them.
You don't deserve my time, and you're not getting a second chance.
She stepped back, heading deeper into the supply closet. Her skin crawled whenever he got close.
Now leave. Our daughter is alone in the middle of the night. I know you fail as a husband, but for God's sakes, don't screw up being a dad.
"Come on, Sarah. I need you."
The sound no longer came from a man. It emanated from an icon of infidelity. She studied the lines in his face, peered into his dull brown eyes, and saw nothing but waxwork, an approximation of a human being. She smirked at the figurine.
I don't need you.
Sarah bared her teeth. It was a self-assured, carnivorous smile.
What you don't seem to understand is that I never did.
And with that, she could have happily eaten him alive. With sorrowful eyes and to her dismay, her prey began to close the distance between them. Instantly, the world turned black. Her partner's familiar tones resounded in unfamiliar anguish, and before her eyes could adjust to the near-complete absence of light, cold steel ran across the good doctor's legs, creating a gaping hole behind her kneecaps. Tools and medicines spilled to the floor, moved by some unseen force. For a moment, the light returned, and she saw Darren beginning to drag himself towards her, blood pouring profusely from the point where his ligaments had been severed.
"Sarah!"
He called from beneath the strobing light, a looming figure behind him. There, in the dark, but gone in a flash. Sarah gritted her teeth against the agony, completely immobilized from the knee down. Darkness came again, and the sound of a scuffle. Her husband was on his back, reaching towards her as she fought to maintain consciousness. Then, the lights died completely.
"Sarah!"
Darren whimpered for a final time. Difficult to see through the shadows.
"Please forgive me."
Bile rose from her gut, and in that instant she forgot the pain as it was replaced so completely by resentment that it became a distant ache. The doctor didn't know what was going on, who had attacked them, or why, or if she was going to live long enough to take her next breath. No, she knew none of that. As the shock began to set in, and her limbs seemed to turn into useless, icy tendrils, she did, however, know exactly what to say.
Go to hell.
The moment she uttered those words, a nauseating crunch filled the room as a terrifying set of claws closed around her husband's head. The creature was on her then, crouched on her chest, its sharp touch breaking the skin. Sarah grasped at the ground, praying that she might find something to defend herself. Her fingers wrapped around a fallen needle and plunged it deep into the monster's back. The tethered tissue that was its mouth spread wide,
a malicious grin revealing blackened and broken teeth. A putrid substance oozed from between them and ran down Dr. Williams' cheek. It pinned her arms, trapping her with inhuman strength. Through the gloom she could see its exposed muscular structure, and she peered into its cold reptilian eyes. A growl of anticipation rumbled in the thing's chest. And it was then that Sarah knew there was no escape. This evil was one with the shadows. She buried her fear deep down, refused to let it show. Sarah Williams will not die weeping, she thought, and in a final act of defiance, she spat in the vile being's face.
Do your fucking worst.
Grin never waning, it took a scalpel in its charred and twisted hand and began its wicked work.
As dusk falls. Arno suddenly took another mouthful of oatmeal and wondered if the box it came in might actually be an improvement. His expression must have said it all.
Oh, come on. It's not that bad.
His wife Johanna insisted, her lips curling into a pert smile. She scraped up her final oats and finished them, gesturing towards her empty bowl.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
He scooped up a little more, his weather-beaten face contorting with disgust the instant it hit his tongue.
Well, if it helps, I'm very proud of you,
Johanna added, scooting her chair out from under the table.
You know, I'm not sure it does,
he murmured, and she gave a short bark of laughter, shaking her head.
Well, it should. I'm trying to keep you around here, but Lord knows I wonder why sometimes.
Because you like to watch me suffer, Arno grumbled.
No, clearly it's because you're such a ray of sunshine.
She rolled her eyes, smirking as she dropped her bowl into the sink. Arno could only grunt in return. Still contending with breakfast, he overheard the newscaster's stoic delivery coming from the living room. Brutal series of murders overseas continues to shock the world. And in
Franz, turn that crap off, would you? I don't want your sister hearing that kind of thing,
he growled.
This is the only freaking channel that comes in clear. It's just a guy talking, Dad. She's fine.
Franz yelled back, sat so low in his chair it appeared most uncomfortable.
It's okay, Dad. It doesn't scare me.
Effie squeaked from her position on the floor. She kicked her feet playfully, unfazed by the disturbing subject matter. Arno sighed deeply. Placing his spoon on the table, he addressed his better half.
I'm gonna go feed the horses,
he huffed.
All right, darling.
Johanna poked her head through the kitchen doorway.
Effie, do you want to come help Mommy with the dishes?
Well, okay, I guess.
Effie replied, unsure about whether she really wanted to help with the dishes at all. She hopped nimbly to her feet and joined her mother. Arno stalked his way through the family room, shooting a quick, disappointed glance at his son as he passed. Franz was far too absorbed in the news story to notice. Through the door and outside, the fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze. The sky was cloudless, and each grain seemed to capture the rays of the early morning sun. The aging farmer made his way amongst the crop, walking a barely visible dirt path that had been baked dry by a relentless heat wave. After several minutes of traversing blindly through, the fence of the horse paddock finally became visible. What lay within its confines shook Arno to his very core.
It looks like something was eating them,
Franz said with obvious revulsion. What remained of the two horses lay still upon the grass. The third, which was at their feet, had not yet ceased to be. Its eyes were agape, unfocused, and its side convulsed violently with each desperate breath. Arno stared down at the broken mare, shotgun slung beneath his arm, his mouth a stern line. He knew what he had to do.
I know of no animal out there that could do this. Do you?
He asked solemnly. Franz shook his head, then crouched down and placed a reassuring hand upon the horse's back. It kicked its hind legs wildly, and more of its innards spilled forth onto the warm earth.
Steady, girl,
he said, stroking at coarse fur.
There's no saving her, is there?
He asked with sorrow.
No, she's suffering. Better to end it quickly.
Arno took his gun in both hands.
I want you to head back to the house. Make sure your sister doesn't try to come out here. Call this in right away, so we can get them out of here as soon as possible. Okay, Dad, I'm on it.
Franz stood, took one final look at the mutilated beast, and strode back towards the farmhouse.
And you go ahead and call the Abels too. See if they've had anything like this happen on their land.
Sure thing. The son spoke softly over his shoulder, then disappeared into the wheat fields. Arno waited for a short while for the rustle of Franz's footsteps to grow quiet. When he could no longer hear his son's movements, he raised his shotgun and stared down the barrel. The horse looked up at him, and for a single moment, it seemed as though it really saw him, and understood.
Rest easy,
he whispered as he cocked the firearm, in the vain hope it might comprehend his reluctance. He squeezed the trigger, and a single shot rang out, and the animal's anguish was ended. And with that, an ominous quiet was cast over the paddock. The old farmer stood for a minute in mute contemplation, his sweaty brow furrowed in concern. An uneasiness had settled in the pit of his stomach, a deep and powerful sense of dread. He gave a silent prayer, one that asked for whatever had brought about such a brutal end to be far away and never return. With a final glance at the mangled remains, he tucked the shotgun back under his arm and headed home. After a hard day's work, Arno's calloused hands and aching muscles lowered him into his soft lounge chair. It felt good to finally relax, as it always did when the upkeep the farm required was complete, at least for the time being. Johanna's content expression explained it better than any words ever could. She sank into a seat of her own, a warm cup of tea in hand. With a period drama playing on the TV, it was a scene that seemed bizarrely normal, considering the unusual discovery of that morning.
The Abels still aren't picking up,
Franz mumbled. He replaced the phone on the receiver and wandered into the kitchen, in search of a post-dinner snack.
Maybe I'll take a walk over there tomorrow, make sure they're doing all right,
Joanna said sleepily. Effie was caught up in conversation with her ragdoll. The two of them seemed to be having quite the adventure on the kitchen floor. Arno had discussed the matter of the horses with his wife, and together they decided that the young girl was better off not understanding their fate. They would come up with a reason for their absence, and an excuse for why they would never return. She was sure to be upset, but at least she would be spared the grisly details. Still, Arno had yet to shake the sensation that something was amiss. That uneasiness sat with him, even as he began to succumb to sleep. Before the Sandman's spell could finally pull him under, a distant bark reanimated the farmer. He sat up in his chair and glanced out at the fields. They were orange in the dying light. The barking grew louder, and louder still, until a black and white sheepdog burst from the narrow dirt path. It sprinted for the house and slammed into the front door, whining loudly and scratching at the wood.
What on earth?
Johanna murmured to herself as she stood. She crossed the room and opened the door. The canine dashed inside and bolted under the kitchen table, where it curled up and trembled uncontrollably.
That's their dog, right?
Franz said, confused.
The doggy is hurt.
Effie scooted under the kitchen table on her knees to get a closer look. Shallow slashes ran across its flank. The wounds were rough and imprecise, unlike that of a blade. The little girl reached out to pet the quivering animal, but as her hand neared, it yelped in discomfort and startled her.
No, leave him alone,
Johanna insisted as she gave chase. She tucked jet-black hair behind her ear and stooped down to take a look for herself.
Let him calm down, and then we'll see if we can get that cleaned up. Get out from under there, Effie, in case he bites.
With all the commotion going on in the kitchen, Arno was alone in the family room. He hauled his aching bones from the lounge chair's soft embrace and made to close the front door. When he reached it, though, something set him on edge. All outdoors was unnervingly still and deathly quiet, save for a faint rustling. He stared out at the crop, which was gradually being consumed by shadow. He spotted movement in the distance. Something was approaching. He shut the door, and feeling a little ridiculous for his groundless anxiety, bolted it and latched the chain. Shifting to the window, the farmer saw that whatever it was drawing closer. He pulled the curtains close as a chill ran through him.
Franz,
He called, hoping to sound innocuous.
yeah?
Franz left the kitchen and the canine-focused fuss behind.
I think something might be out there. It's probably nothing, but go upstairs and take a look, would you?
It was barely more than a whisper. The son nodded, reading the concern in his father's eyes. He scaled the steps quickly and entered the bedroom he shared with his younger sibling. He kneeled on the bed that sat below the windowsill, and his sight fell upon approaching forms. Trails appeared in the wheat as it was trampled underfoot by the mysterious horrors that stalked towards them.
Dad, where's the gun?
Franz called, trying to remain composed. He hopped off the bed and walked quickly to the top of the stairs.
Back in the cabinet in the cellar. Why?
Arno asked, apprehension etching lines on his forehead.
Whatever is out there, there's a bunch of them, and they're coming this way.
The clatter of smashing glass echoed through the house, and the thud of laden footsteps came from Franz's room. He glanced back. Through the gap in the doorway, he caught a small glimpse of a twisted figure.
Shit! Something's inside!
He yelled, diving for the door, just as the being on the other side tried to shove its way out onto the landing.
Dad, help!
Arno hurried up the stairs as quickly as his worn body would allow, and joined Franz in keeping the intruder at bay. He pushed with all his might, as whatever fought back launched its entire weight at them in an attempt to break through.
Find something to block the door. I'll hold it.
Arno hissed through gritted teeth.
But, Dad, just do it,
he demanded.
What's going on up there?
Johanna called, fear marring her tone.
Mom, call the police. Something is in here.
Franz hollered, as he struggled to single-handedly push a hefty chest of drawers towards the bedroom doorway. Johanna grabbed the phone in the living room and was frantically telling the emergency services their address, just as Arno and Franz managed to wedge the bedroom door closed. It continued to rattle as the creature made further attempts to breach the makeshift defense.
What the hell is that thing? How many do you think are out there?
Arno panted.
I barely saw it. There were 5 trails, though, coming through the field. We need to lock this place down.
Franz rambled in a panic.
I'll take care of downstairs. You try to find a way to keep them out of the other bedroom.
All right, I can do that. Arno headed back down and began to shove a bookcase full of texts he had never bothered to read in front of the ground floor window.
Effie, get in here and close the door.
He grunted under strain as the feet of the bookcase ground against the slate flooring.
Come on, puppy.
Effie, with her rag doll in hand, patted at her leg, urging the dog out from under the table.
Effie, now!
Arno demanded. The window blocked, he marched over and grabbed his daughter by the arm.
Daddy, no, we need to keep him safe.
She protested. Perhaps his heart was growing soft in his old age, because when he looked upon the trembling mutt, he couldn't bear to leave it there. Arno hurriedly paced back into the kitchen, and taking the dog by the collar, he dragged the reluctant hound into the family room with them.
They said it'll take them about 20 minutes to get out here.
Johanna told him. His mind raced. 20 minutes seemed like an eternity.
Slide the couch over here and block off the kitchen. Put as much weight on it as you can.
Arno told her, trying to remain composed for the good of the family.
I'm going to get the gun.
Hurry,
his wife whispered.
Mom, what's going on?
Effie quivered.
We're just playing a game, darling. We're building a fort,
she replied, beginning her work on the barricade. Arno opened the cellar door beneath the staircase. It led to its own flight that went underneath the house. He pulled the cord to spark the dim light into action, and immediately ran down the stairs, almost losing his footing. Hobbling over to the gun cabinet, he grabbed the keys that hung on a hook. Aged fingers opened the locker and put the ring of keys back in their rightful place. Taking up the shotgun for the second time that day, Arno noted that there was one shell still loaded and ready to fire, then grabbed an ammo box that contained 4 extras. Another pane shattered in the distance. A pained screech followed shortly after.
Dad, help me!
Arno's blood ran cold as he heard the cry.
Franz!
He hollered, rushing towards his son. He didn't get there quickly enough to see the dark, scaly hands that grabbed the boy, or the struggle that took place as the teen was dragged through the broken window. The father did, however, get there just in time to see the winged beast that carried his son, silhouetted against the bleeding sky.
Let him go!
Arno screamed, but it was, of course, pointless. He took aim, hesitating for a second, terrified he might place the shot and find the wrong target. Then he found his nerve, exhaled purposefully, and squeezed. A thunderous bang echoed off the walls around him, and a haunting shriek of pain rang out as the contents of the shell tore through the being's bat-like wing. It lost its grip on Franz, and the boy fell down into the field, his legs splintering upon impact. The sound of his anguish filled the air.
Franz, I'm coming to get you!
Arno called out.
No, Dad.
The son yelled back, face down in the dirt.
Don't come out here.
He grimaced in unimaginable pain. One of the strange entities crept its way over to him, placed a disfigured foot upon his mutilated leg, and sunk its talons deep into flesh. The 17-year-old shrieked in such agony that he neared losing consciousness. The being, shrouded by the still crops, peered curiously at the window where the father stood. Arno finished the job Franz had started as quickly as possible. He moved the wardrobe in order to seal the opening that was the shattered window, and wheeled the bed in front of it for extra support. It made for a decent blockade. He hoped that it would be enough to keep the creatures at bay. Johanna was teary-eyed, even over the laughter track of the ridiculous show that had begun to air.
What's happening to him, Mom?
Effie questioned her anxiously. She couldn't lie. Couldn't think of anything to say that would make the situation seem any better, even to a child.
I don't know, honey.
She squeezed her daughter's hands tenderly.
I have to get out there,
Arno stated, as he made his way back down to them.
You can't. Maybe we can wait for the police.
Johanna protested, even though the thought of leaving Franz out there alone sickened her.
Listen to him! He won't last that long out there with those things. I have to move, now.
He spat aggressively.
You won't make it out there either.
She yelled in anger. Their eyes locked, but neither spoke another word as that thought sunk in. The situation had swiftly become more real to them, and the severity of what was happening, and what might be yet to happen, was impossible to articulate. Arno broke the barrel of the shotgun and emptied the spent shells. He loaded it with 2 more from the box and snapped it closed once more.
Lock the door after I leave. Head down into the cellar. The key to get to the outside is on the hook next to the cabinet. If they get in there, you take Effie and you run. Head straight for the road.
You can't do this, Arno.
She shook her head in disbelief. Franz's tortured sobbing was still audible in the distance.
I have to try,
he snapped, fighting back the urge to cry. He tucked 2 extra shells into his pocket and nervously grabbed a fistful of his own gray hair.
Daddy, please don't go outside.
Effie whimpered.
It's going to be fine, sweetheart,
he promised her, stooping down to kiss her on the forehead. Johanna grabbed him, tears finally breaking free. She kissed her husband and embraced him tightly.
I love you.
Her voice trembled, and Arno's features tightened. He couldn't say it back. If he spoke another word, he would break down. So instead, Arno merely nodded, as shudder passed through his entire body. Shotgun under his arm, he strode for the door, removed the bolts and the chain, and stepped outside to meet his fate. Johanna tried to regain her composure. Breathing deeply as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she locked the door as instructed, took a hold of Effie's hand, and led her down the cellar steps. The terrified dog followed them willingly this time. For Arno, the sound of the TV sitcom faded, as the pained cries of Franz became sharper. He tiptoed his way forward, firearm at the ready, and breached the outer edge of the wheat field. The old man was all but blind as he made his way towards where Franz had fallen. Then a sudden burst of movement came from his left. He wheeled around and fired. Johanna took the key from the hook and flinched as she heard the unmistakable crack of gunfire. The little girl began to speak, but her mother shushed her softly. The quieter they were, the better chance they had of remaining undiscovered. They snuck their way over to the steps that led to the cellar's hatch. The sheepdog retreated to the corner of the dingy room, lay down, and whined quietly. Whatever Arno had shot at, he had missed, but it had retreated. He quickened his pace, and his heart rate elevated to match. Another abrupt advance. This time it came from behind. He spun, shooting towards the shadowy beast, and was rewarded with a glottal screech as the pellets found their mark. Wounded, it bounded back into hiding. He broke the barrel, dumped the shells, and began to reload on the move. Effie watched intently as her mother inserted the key into the padlock that kept the chain on the hatch in place. With the lock removed, she gently pulled at the chain, attempting to unwind it from the handles with minimal noise. Every clattering link seemed to speak of their location. Johanna just hoped it was quiet enough to go unheard. The time-worn farmer snapped the barrel back into place. His final 2 shells were ready to go. Franz's weeping was close. Arno continued to follow the sound until he spotted the boy laying in a heap on the ground amongst the crops.
"Franz,"
he said in a hoarse whisper, jogging over.
"Franz, I'm here." "Dad,"
the boy whimpered, blood streaming like tears.
"you shouldn't have come out here."
His leg was utterly destroyed, his body covered in shallow lacerations, and his eyes no longer saw a thing. Then there was movement all around them. Johanna placed the chain on the ground and sat on the wooden steps that would be their only means of escape, should it come to that. She beckoned to Effie over, who was still clutching her beloved rag doll. The little girl joined her, and they leaned on each other in silence as they waited.
"What's happening, Dad?"
Franz rasped from his place upon the soil.
"The police are here, Franz. We made it. Everything is going to be all right,"
Arno said reassuringly, gazing around at the winged figures that watched them from the shade.
"I can't see, Dad. Please get me out of here."
The old man looked down at his disfigured boy.
"Please,"
Franz said, as a terrified shudder shook his broken body. Arno clenched his teeth. It took everything he had to maintain the illusion. A small, forced smile gave his next words a false sense of authenticity.
"Okay, Franz. Let's get out of here."
The boy gave a weak and thankful sigh as the monsters crawled towards them. His father aimed the gun low. There was no time to think. He exhaled, whispered a sorrowful goodbye, and reluctantly pulled the trigger. And with that, his son was no more. The creatures leapt back and made hideous croaking calls to each other. The old man, resigned to his fate, positioned the smoking barrel beneath his chin. However, before Arno could spend his final shell, he locked stares with one of the foul terrors. Its wing was bloody and torn, A burning hatred filled the farmer's heart. He took aim, and with his final shot, tore the face off the fiend. Then, the rest of them were upon him. Johanna wept silently as the final round was fired. She clung to her little girl firmly, and listened intently to what was going on above. The TV continued to fill the living room with its light-hearted programming in spite of the horrific events unfolding. Over the sound of laughter, more glass shattered. Heavy footfalls above them sent dust spiraling down from the ceiling. The menacing clatter of the things above trying to break through, to breach the crude barricades, drowned out everything. It wasn't long before they found success.
Effie, we have to run, okay?
She took her daughter's hand again.
I promise I won't let go. Okay, Mom.
The little girl replied meekly, with her precious doll still tucked under her arm. Johanna glanced at the priceless toy.
You hold her tight.
Effie nodded, and the flimsy door that led back into the house burst open, as a shadow crept across the cellar floor behind them. The mother, the daughter, and the dog all raced out into the dusk-charged air.
Spun. She's the one. I can sense it. I have that feeling. A sensation oh so rare. Some people call it butterflies. Others call it love. Call it whatever you like. All I know for sure is that something within me is stirring. A certainty surrounds me, pervading the very atmosphere in my own little slice of suburbia. As she sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, I could not believe my luck. Just to be in her presence is intoxicating. Her essence alone is enough to ensnare the senses. She sipped seductively at the coffee I prepared for her, and for a moment I prayed that it was enough to satiate her thirst, that the taste was adequate to satisfy. The butterflies flapped their wings in response to my apprehension. She smiled with soft red lips and bared pearl-white teeth in a humble display of gratitude. I knew I had done enough. The knot in my stomach loosened a little. I had doubted she would ever accept my invitation. The gravity of her beauty could pull the very sun from the sky, and should it crash down to earth and burn us all to ashes, I can only ask that she be the last thing I ever see. Her allure had not gone unnoticed by the others in the neighborhood. The eyes of each man tracked her in motion, her every graceful stride, spied through twitching curtains. I wasn't content to be another voyeur. After a couple of days as being one of the watchers, I could stand to keep my distance no longer. The steps I took down her garden path were some of the most daunting I have ever had to take. I rapped gently at her door, not wanting to disturb or startle her. Something so radiant must be delicate. The finest things always are, and should be treated as such. She answered quickly, wearing nothing more than an oversized shirt that clung to her curves, leaving slender legs exposed. She greeted me, and suddenly, words failed. I shuddered uncomfortably, before finally sputtering out a pathetic offer to help her unpack. She glanced at the pile of boxes at her back, and assured me with a wondrous smirk that she appreciated the offer, but would be fine. It was then I managed to choke out a proposal of coffee at my place. In return, I was gifted a short, musical laugh, and her gracious acceptance. So somehow it had happened. When the time came, I'm sure the envious eyes peering at her from the shadows found much hatred for me. Their hearts were unquestionably overcome with jealousy when they saw her crossing the street and daintily ringing the doorbell of my modest home. I rushed to let her inside, hoping I looked respectable enough to entertain such an effortlessly glamorous guest. When I opened the door, the fading daylight perfectly complemented her caramel complexion. Her skin was flawless, and I ached to touch it, but I dare not, for fear of causing offense. She came inside, and waited patiently as I prepared her drink, and tried my utmost to fill any silence with small talk. Conversation to me seemed difficult. My mountainous challenge was to remain interesting. She, on the other hand, made it look uncomplicated. Her melodic voice seemed to create harmonies all on its own, and the notes she hit struck a chord with me. Every word carried a hypnotic quality, leaving me unable to focus. When enough of my senses had finally returned, I handed her that coffee I was so damn nervous about. We continued to speak until darkness fell, but now I have no recollection of the topic of conversation. I was too infatuated with the way her silky locks of ashen hair fell, and the emerald-like shimmer of her bright green eyes to take note of any meaningless words. Cool air drifted lazily through the lounge as the minutes ticked by. I treasured every second, fearing that this would be the only time I would ever have her to myself. I knew that she was on the mind of every other man, married or otherwise. I was no competition. It was then that events took a sudden turn. She turned to me. She told me she had noticed how I looked at her. She knew what was going on in my head, and she felt it too. I knew it. I knew it was love at first sight, from the instant she fell into view. I was enthralled. My heart raced at the thought that she felt the same. This was a connection like no other, the very essence of a romance tale, but manifested in reality. My anxious thoughts dissipated fully, to be replaced wholly by joy. I took her in my arms, holding her close on the couch, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. She stood, taking my hand and bringing me up along with her.
There's no time to waste,
she told me, with that stunning smile. She pulled me close and closed her perfect eyes. Her kiss was mesmerizing. I became lost in its liquid flow as her tongue met mine. She tasted as sweet as summer fruits, and her scent complemented her flavor. I wished for it to be endless as her hands found my back, sealing me in her embrace. Sadly, it was over all too soon. She relaxed and retreated, taking a step away from me. She told me she had to go. I asked why, and got no response. I couldn't understand. Our feelings were mutual. She had said so herself. Her lips curled upwards in the cutest smirk, and the butterflies wreaked havoc in my gut. I clutched at a painful stomach and asked if I would see her again soon. She told me, "Sure," with a twisted half grin, and began to walk away. I followed, and the hyperactive butterflies doubled their efforts. She reached the doorway, and I asked her to wait. I stumbled backwards and fell to the ground, bringing the ornamental contents of a shelf down with me. My legs had become numb, and that lack of feeling was spreading upwards. My eyes darted in confusion. She couldn't leave. We have to be together. She told me she'd had fun, but she really had to go. What was her name again? There was a dull twitch within my abdomen, and I barely felt a thing as black fangs chewed their way through my pale body. I stared up at her back as she stood near the exit. A sweet little giggle escaped from her lungs. Huge, dark spears spread from my core, fanning out to find grip, planting themselves on my sensationless skin. Smaller shapes scuttled forth from the hole that was created, and I tingled all over as they began to feed. I prayed for the sun to fall. I'd gladly have settled for the moon. If she was going, she had to be the last thing I ever saw. Glancing over her shoulder, she laughed another short and beautiful laugh, flashing pointed canines for a brief instant. Her pristine porcelain hand opened the door, and then she was gone. Sadness overcame me. She was the one. How could she go? Tears began to form as the great arachnid hauled itself out of the open wound and crawled over my chest. Its enormous fangs dripped a foul-smelling, acidic substance across my torso as it moved. It stung a little, as its serrated jaws found flesh. So now, as I lay dying, the last thing I see is me, stained red, reflected in 8 black, soulless eyes. My final thought is of her.
Behind bars. An obnoxious buzz filled the hallway as the security gate rattled open.
"You must be Agent Ward, right?"
The overweight prison guard mumbled as the dark-skinned man in a deep blue suit approached him.
"Right, you are,"
Ward replied, shaking the guard's hand firmly.
"Are you the one that found them?"
Yeah, that was me. Name's Eddie,"
he stammered nervously, taking a sip from a steaming styrofoam cup.
"It's good to meet you, Eddie. How you holding up?"
The agent asked.
"Oh, I'm fine. I mean, it's a little weird. We're used to violence amongst the inmates, but finding my coworkers, that's not so easy to stomach. It's like I talk to those guys almost every day, you know?"
The portly guard was clearly shaken, but Ward found his attempts to put on a brave face to be admirable.
"I understand. I'm sure you're itching to get out of here, so I won't take up too much of your time. If you could just walk me through what happened, tell me everything you can remember, then you can be on your way,"
he said with calculated sincerity.
"All right. Sure thing. I can do that,"
Eddie muttered in obvious distress.
"This way."
Agent Grayson Ward of the Federal Bureau of Investigation walked alongside Edward, the prison guard, as he began to recount the story of how his gruesome discovery was made. Their footsteps were amplified in the barren hallway of the maximum security penitentiary, a facility that held some of the USA's most dangerous criminals. What had taken place was unheard of and seemingly impossible.
"So I was doing my rounds as usual when I spotted the first body up in D-Wing. I radioed the guys in our surveillance hub, but obviously they didn't answer."
The guard wheezed.
"And then you went to see why, and that's when you found them, correct?"
"Yeah, exactly. I can show you the surveillance room now. The forensics crew are still working on it."
Eddie took a hard right down another Spartan corridor as Grayson followed. They came to a hefty-looking door. A battered tin box kept it from closing. Agent Ward eyed it over, taking in the details. It was a security door, weighted to close automatically. There were no windows, no obvious weak points, and the door itself had sustained no apparent damage at all. A numeric keypad with a card reader sat upon the wall, next to its chrome handle. Quiet chatter could be heard coming from the other side.
"The forensics guys have wedged this open so they can come and go, but when I got here, it was locked tight as usual,"
Eddie said, gesturing towards the room.
"Are there any other points of entry?"
"Nah, that's it. You need to know the code, and you need a card to get in,"
the guard explained.
"You mind if I take a look at one of those cards?"
Grayson asked.
"Oh, not at all, sir."
Eddie pulled the lanyard from around his neck. Attached was a card that allowed him to access the various areas of the prison. It was a glossy red, with no markings. A black magnetic strip ran across the rear of it. Agent Ward also noted that the room itself was unmarked, and considered the potential that the perpetrator might be someone who already understood the layout of the prison.
"Have any of these cards gone missing?"
He spoke quietly, contemplating possible means and motives.
"Not as far as I'm aware, unless one of the guys in there are short of his."
The prison guard gave a quick glance in the direction of the surveillance hub.
"I'm going to have to take a quick look at the scene,"
Grayson stated, retrieving a set of latex gloves from the pocket inside of his jacket.
"All right, I'll just wait here, I guess."
Eddie smiled weakly and took another delicate sip of the piping hot coffee. The agent tugged his gloves down into place and reached high up on the door to minimize the risk of contaminating any potential evidence. He eased it open and slipped into the surveillance room. What lay before him was a jarring tableau
The grim authenticity of the crime scene was given a sense of artificiality by the harsh lights that the forensics team had put in place. A bank of destroyed screens filled the back wall. A large control console sat beneath them, and slumped upon it was one of the victims. To Grayson's left, a second body lay facing the ceiling. Scattered across the floor were bright yellow evidence markers, each with their own number assigned. 2 near shapeless people were examining the victim still seated, covered from head to toe in overalls. One of them peered over a shoulder. His eyes caught the sight of the suit through the protective goggles.
"Ah, you must be the guy from the bureau."
A deep male voice came from behind a white face mask.
Agent Ward.
Grayson nodded in greeting.
"Well, you'll need one of these."
The male analyst huffed, as he crouched down to retrieve an extra mask from his kit.
Watch your footing, Agent.
A higher, female voice emanated from the second suit.
This place is a mess.
She snapped a close-up of the dead guard's face with an expensive-looking camera. Ward pulled his mask into place. It covered his nose and mouth, the smell of it reminiscent of the stench of a hospital waiting room. He placed his steps carefully, avoiding the splattered blood and innocuous artifacts scattered upon the ground. Any one of them could be vital to the case. He peered over the top of the female lab tech, down into the brightly lit, empty stare of the corpse. She took another picture.
Every time, the same damn thing,
the agent whispered to himself.
They all have facial lacerations, correct?
Yeah, we're pretty sure they were inflicted post-mortem,
she said, zooming in on the gaping wound that stretched from the victim's lips to his ears.
"The way it looks right now, we think that the perpetrator took the stiff at the controls by surprise. A single shot to the carotid artery appears to be what took him out."
The man spoke, pointing down at a large hole in the guard's neck. Dark, arterial blood had pooled between the console's keys and continued to drip onto the ground.
"The second Vic looks like he put up a fight. We've got multiple defensive injuries to the forearms, and a hell of a lot of stab wounds to the chest."
Are either of them missing their access cards?
Grayson asked, observing the spatter on the walls near the body on the ground.
Nope, they're both still carrying them.
The woman took another snap, this time of the pool at the victim's feet.
There's no way someone could have gotten in here without them noticing, and it's not like they'd have opened the door for someone they didn't recognize. So far, none of this is making any sense. All of the surveillance equipment is fucked, but we have some of our guys scrubbing through the footage of the hallway outside. It captured up until the moment this stuff was destroyed.
Agent Ward glanced up into the corners of the room and observed that there were no cameras.
It looks like they don't have anything watching in here.
Nah, for obvious reasons. I guess they didn't think they'd need it.
She shrugged.
We found a bunch of prints, though. We'll have to check them against the guards. If we get anything that doesn't match up, we'll run it through the database and hope we got whoever it is on file.
"That's assuming it wasn't a guard that did it," the other added. "I mean, it has to be right. Who else could have gotten into the cells, and in this room?"
Agent Grayson did not respond. He instead locked his eyes with the deceased in mute contemplation. The body count was rising. His team had so far found no hard evidence to link them to a suspect, and the media was all over the story. The signature grin etched upon the faces of each found dead was exactly the kind of horrifying gimmick that the news stations longed to capitalize on. Truth be told, he was certain it wasn't a guard. There were too many victims, spread over too wide an area, for the perpetrator to be someone close to this case in particular.
You mind if I keep this?
He pointed towards the mask.
"It's yours."
The male analyst gave a small salute.
You're doing fine work. Be sure to send anything else you come up with our way.
The agent gave a quick bow and received an understanding nod for his troubles. He carefully crossed the room and slipped back out into the hallway, no better off than when he had entered.
"It's a real bloodbath in there, huh?"
Eddie shuddered, clutching the now half-empty cup in both hands. Grayson pulled the mask down and clung to it at chest height as he began to walk with Edward once more.
That's one way to describe it.
"So you guys onto anyone? Like, This has to be a coordinated group, right?
The guard asked with an air of concern. They passed into D-Wing, where the narrow corridor gave way to a large rectangular room. Cells lined the walls, and a heavy sense of oppression seemed to hang in the air. The raucous sound of the inmates outside in the yard managed to penetrate the colossal concrete structure. As I'm sure you can understand, I'm not at liberty to discuss any elements of an ongoing investigation. Ward's rehearsed spiel came off as impeccably polite and professional.
But these killings are all over the news, with the Chelsea smiles cut into the faces and all that. I mean, it's everywhere?
Eddie rambled, as he breathlessly led the way to the first of the dead prisoners. Grayson's jaw tightened.
Okay, I get that you can't say anything, but I'm safe at least, right? Like, lightning doesn't strike twice, eh?
It hasn't yet, the agent stated, giving a look that said he could speak no more. They passed by 4 cells, and each contained a grinning carcass, slumped against a cot or laid out on the ground.
We haven't opened these at all. We decided to keep them sealed until the forensics team has time to check them out,
Ed explained, giving a quick wave to a colleague who was searching through a convict's bedding on the floor above them. Good call. So, how many are there? Agent Ward asked.
Well, there are 4 here in D, but that's not even the weirdest part. They got 7 dead cons total, and 3 of them are through here,
Edward said, thrusting a chubby finger in the direction of yet another gate. The sign above read, Solitary Confinement. Grayson slid the cell's viewing panel open with a latex-covered hand, and on the other side, predictably, was another carcass. This one was a Hispanic male, heavily tattooed, again with multiple stab wounds to the torso. However, unlike with the others, a peculiar detail caught the agent's eye. Can we get this one open? Agent Ward requested, resituating his mask.
You got it.
Eddie fumbled around with a ring full of keys until he found the correct one. He rattled it into the lock, then Ward took over, twisting the key and carefully pulling the handle down, whilst making as little contact with it as possible. Ward crossed the cramped space cautiously, avoiding the spots on the floor that were stained a murky red. He got as close to the fallen prisoner as he could, in order to more closely observe the mass of mangled flesh around the victim's collarbone.
What is it?
Edward asked from the doorway. Ward remained composed, keeping his features static. He couldn't be certain of what he was seeing. He'd wait for the professionals to make the final verdict on what had managed to rend the flesh from the shoulder of the mutilated felon. As he stared unblinking at the bloody mess, however, he could swear that the deep marks he observed were created by human teeth. His focus was broken as the cell phone in his pocket rumbled to life. He retrieved it and tapped at the screen to answer. Ward.
We've got more bodies,
Agent Fuller stated bluntly.
Looks like these ones have been here for a little while. Same M.O.
Jesus. Are they close? Grayson spoke under his breath.
Close? They're not even in the state.
Fuller gave a bark of humorless laughter, and the agent crouched by the corpse rubbed at his eyes, stressed, and wondered just what the hell they were dealing with.
What's the situation on your end?
9 Vics, 2 guards, and 7 cons. 3 of those were in solitary. The prisoners here belonged to different gangs, and they were convicted of different crimes. No obvious relationships between them.
So there's no rhyme or reason to it. You'll have to forgive me for not being surprised.
Agent Fuller spoke sharply. Yeah, but that's not what's throwing me here. Whoever did this could get anywhere somehow, and this is a maximum security correctional facility, designed to stop exactly that. So the question isn't why they killed who they did, it's why did they stop at 9? Grayson kept his voice low, still conscious of Edward lurking nearby.
Well, shit. With a body count like that, maybe they just tired themselves out?
Agent Fuller replied absent-mindedly, apparently distracted by other matters. A loud bang from the cell next door startled Eddie, who spilled what little remained of his bitter-tasting beverage.
Can I get some goddamn food in here or what?
A raspy voice called out. "I've got to go." Grayson hung up immediately, then stood and turned his attention back to the guard. "There's someone still alive in solitary?"
Yeah, just the one guy,"
Eddie said. Grayson's mind raced. This was the closest thing to a witness so far. "I'm going to need to speak with him." Welcome to the horror show. So many lost souls wander beneath the neon lights. Vegas, the acceptable face of sin. Decadence prevails and addiction rules. Women sell their bodies for easy money, and the scuttling masses feed the great machine. It inhales vast profits and exhales misery, leaving those misguided enough to drop their savings on the roll of a dice with nothing but empty hands to fill their empty pockets. It's a town of misdirection, intent on distracting patrons from the fact that it exists solely to rob them blind. The sheep cheered as the final knife landed a fraction away from the face of the glittering showgirl. She beamed out at the crowd with teeth of blinding white, still slowly rotating on the target board. The so-called entertainer bowed and thanked the audience for their wondrous praise, devouring attention greedily like an emaciated dog. Unbeknownst to them, one amongst them did not shower him with rapturous appreciation. She sat instead, head on hand, twisting a lock of deep blue hair between her fingers. Thank you. Now for my next trick, I will kindly ask my beautiful assistant to climb into this box." The magician gestured towards a bedazzled, coffin-sized crate at center stage. A weary sigh escaped downturned lips, for it was such an outdated illusion. The sparkling showgirl was released from her restraints, and with wide, graceful steps, she reached the decorated wooden box. As she daintily placed herself inside, hand wrapped in the magician's greasy paw, he made a smug remark. "Trust me, you'll be fine, dear. I do not do things by half." The showman winked as the crowd bleated encouragingly. His sight fell upon the bored-looking lady. "Hey, what's the matter, Blue? Ladies and gentlemen, I have succeeded in making a young lady's sense of humor disappear," the would-be wizard announced triumphantly. Hundreds erupted into insincere fits of laughter. "Have an open mind, my dear. I think you'll enjoy this next one," the performer assured her. Were it possible, a smirk would have gone unseen beneath the cowl of the girl he referred to as Blue. Now then, he said from behind his bleached smile, closing the box and leaving only his assistant's head and feet exposed. "Which tool will be the most effective for efficiently dividing this divine beauty?" He approached a table, laden with a litter of lacerating potential. The magic man waved his hands mysteriously over each of the objects, with an air of concentration, feigning focus. His grip fell upon a formidable-looking revolver. Obnoxiously, he twirled it in his finger and holstered it in his belt, ready for an upcoming illusion. "Ah, this will do nicely," the fraud in the suit announced with his back to the audience, selecting a frightening-looking chainsaw from his choice of wonderful weapons. The audience gasped in unison, whilst the captive assistant entertained them with her greatest imitation of fear. Her acting left something to be desired. The magician pulled the cord and the chainsaw burst into life, teeth twisting with terrifying speed. He stalked forwards as the showgirl's legs flailed in a meager attempt to create tension. The illusionist raised the snarling device above his head. Then something in his expression changed. His smile remained, his jaws locked in apparent stasis, yet his eyes began to dart erratically. The spinning chain came down. Wood began to splinter. The saw shrieked as it tore its way relentlessly through. Suddenly the assistant squealed. Bright red lips began parting as her blood-curdling scream intensified. A vivid ruby spray burst forth, showering the stage and crowd alike. The bejeweled woman in the box released a few desperate gasps, and then fell silent, feet still kicking away. The magician, maintaining his unnerving expression, carelessly cast his chainsaw to the ground. It growled idly on the floor, still thirsty for destruction. "Ladies and gentlemen," He spoke through gritted teeth, placing gloved hands on the slickened shell of the broken casket. "Welcome to the horror show!" As the box was forced apart, vile viscera spilled out onto the stage with a sickening splat. The crowd exploded into a manic frenzy, scrambling to escape the unsightly scene. "Now for the grand finale!" The magician's voice broke as he said those words. All the while his eyes were perpetual in their erratic motion, and that grin remained etched in place. Blue's hands danced as he raised the revolver to his head, and still beaming wide with his pearly whites, he squeezed the trigger. People clambered over each other, desperate to escape as the ear-splitting shot rang out. Brain matter fell upon the well-trodden boards. Claret poured from the performer's nose as he lay motionless, grin finally fading, becoming a neutral expression. The motorized legs continued to kick ferociously. After all else became silent, a single feminine figure remained in her seat, the epitome of lethargy. The curtains began to close, gradually sealing away the disturbing display. Taking one last longing look, Blue so desired to sink her teeth into her concealed lip. The sheep, all content to follow the first, ran screaming into the brightest of nights. The dark below. The goldfish floated on the surface, bobbing gently on its side within the tiny tank that was its entire world. Aurora sighed from behind the glass, her warm breath creating a fog upon it that obscured her view. She cupped delicate hands and scooped up the fish from the water, crossing her modest apartment to the bathroom. Dropping it into the toilet, she pulled the chain, and it spiraled its way into a most undignified end. Wiping her palms on her shirt, Aurora ambled back into the living space. Taking a battered old guitar in hand, she slumped onto the bed and began to pluck at the strings with nails grown for the purpose. As she tuned her instrument, a rhythmic, gentle patter caught her ear. She glanced up at the ceiling and spotted a warped, discolored spot. It fell into an inverted peak, and from that peak, droplets fell, splashing onto the wooden flooring. Aurora released another exasperated huff, knowing the landlord would care little about her increasingly shabby home. Then she lay down on her back, and facing the heavens, she began to play. As dusk made its presence known, sending golden light into the bathroom through a frosted window, Aurora bathed. Smooth jazz played quietly on a worn-out radio, the music unstructured and ever-flowing. She submerged herself, and rinsed suds from long hair that was a chocolate brown. Beneath the water, the world above became muted. Somehow, though, a muffled scuttling seemed to find her ears, as if something were moving close by. The woman in the tub raised herself from the depths, listening carefully to see if the phenomenon persisted, but all was peaceful. The humid air in the bathroom filled her lungs, yet it was unsatisfying, as the stifling heat caused her to be breathless in spite of it. Feeling suffocated, she quickly washed her blushing face and climbed out of the bath, wrapping a heavy towel around her exposed body. Before she could dry herself off, a startling clatter came from outside of the room. A sense of being uncomfortably defenseless began to manifest itself as Aurora left the bathroom in her disrobed state. Her every movement caused her damp skin to feel a chill that otherwise would have not been, and her concern grew as she inched her way towards the origin of the sound. When she rounded the corner, the cause of commotion caught her attention. A grate, part of the apartment's ventilation system, had come free from the wall and fallen to the ground. Liquid leaked from the open vent and pooled around the dented metal cover as it lay there uselessly. Aurora cursed under her breath and marched indignantly towards her phone. Flipping through the phone book, she found the number for the building's maintenance man. But when she called, a robotic voice told her that the number was no longer in use. Irritated, she slammed the phone back into its cradle, her mood becoming suitably sour. Trapped in a realm of abstract unreality, a slender figure wandered, lost and isolated. Oppressive force seemed to close in from all sides, making her movement slow and unrelentingly tiring. Shapes most unclear twisted and twirled, undulating unnaturally before dispersing and becoming one with the dense sky. The woman reached out, trying to take in hand that which moved so gracefully, where she could scarcely move at all. Alas, the ethereal forms were always just out of reach. After a time, all hope left the girl who roamed, for she would always be alone, with that realization her only companion. She lay down upon the sand and stared up into the void. There, in peaceful silence, she closed her eyes and waited to die. In the middle of the night, the sleeping lady awoke to the sensation of a colossal weight upon her chest. Panic came immediately, and as Aurora's eyes adjusted to the lack of light, she caught the sight of what had bound her. Long, slimy appendages lay across her body and held her tightly. She gasped, hoping to draw in enough breath to scream. However, before she could make a sound, more of the slick, amorphous arms found their way across her throat. Aurora could not speak or move, and that which squeezed the life out of her seemed to be stronger as her desperation grew. The disgusting limbs contracted ever tighter, and trapped in the bed, she started to fade. Spots began to form in her vision, and a heart with no air to pump beat ever faster, in a futile attempt to keep her conscious. In an instant, it was all over. The strange entity was gone, and she was free to inhale again. Panting frantically and on the verge of a panic attack, Aurora clambered out of bed. Her anxious eyes scoured the room. There was nothing out of the ordinary, and there seemed to be no reasonable place that the mysterious being could have come from, if it were truly there at all. Nervously she dropped to the ground and peeked beneath where she slept, but there was naught to be found below. An unexpected thump came from the ceiling overhead, and Aurora flinched reflexively. The damp spot above began to drip again, birthing an irritating rhythm. The floorboards upon which it landed had already begun to distort, and so, trying to regain her grip on normality, the shaken girl retrieved a bucket from her storage closet and placed it beneath the leak. The sound of every droplet was amplified by it, landing with a shrill clang. Outside of the busy cafe, the Parisian streets were crowded with both locals and tourists alike. Inside the premises was almost as chaotic in its own right. Weary from a lack of slumber and rushed off her feet by the hectic pace of her workload, Aurora dashed from table to table taking orders and clearing away the messes of countless patrons. Her restless hours had been spent researching the possible cause of her late-night terror, but the possibility of sleep paralysis or sudden onset psychosis did little to improve her feelings about the bizarre event. At a table near the window that overlooked the crowded sidewalk, a red-faced boy cried loudly, and the sound of it set her teeth on edge. She took the order of a well-dressed man, who spoke with sheer confidence. He learned her name from the tag on her chest, and asked brazenly for her phone number. She merely raised a hand, displaying a wedding ring that had long since lost all relevance, then immediately returned to the grind. A noisy complaint from a customer who felt she was being too inefficient was loud enough for her to hear. A polite apology and a smile that could have almost passed for genuine was her response. She hurried off to fetch their order. As the shift went on, her stress levels continued to rise, and as a child continued to scream, a deep, unsettling disquiet bloomed in her heart. Despite her exhaustion, even after the cold night closed in, Aurora had not yet returned home. She sat upon a chilly step. The Sacré-Cœur church behind her was the highest point in the sky, and also happened to be a hot spot for travelers. As she finished playing a song on her guitar, a small audience clapped, and threw change into the instrument's case that lay open at her feet. Aurora thanked them gratefully, pulling her woolen hat lower to fend off the chill air, and breathing into her icy hands as the unimpressive crowd dispersed. While she waited for the feeling in her fingers to return, she sat and watched as people peddled their wares to tourists, low-quality junk that no one in their right mind would ever want. Sightseers continuously amassed to look upon the beautiful architecture of the church, to explore within it, and to get a view of Paris from on high. The lights of the city did have a certain charm to them, but for Aurora, her regular trips to the Sacré-Cœur had more to do with making her rent payments. As she adjusted the tuning and prepared for her next song, a blonde woman with a bundle in her arms and a toddler by her side approached.
You have a beautiful singing voice.
the mother said in her upper-class British accent.
Thank you. I'm glad you like it.
Aurora replied in a manner somewhat broken, her English less than perfect. She eyed her strings, anxious at the thought of looking up at them all.
Will you be singing another?
The tourist asked. And in spite of herself, the lady with the guitar could not help but glimpse at the toddler at the parent's side. When she saw the little boy's faded eyes and bloated visage, she gasped in fright. He appeared corpse-like and locked his dead stare with hers.
Est-ce tout ce que vous espérez qu'il sera?
He asked flawlessly in her native tongue, as rancid liquid poured from his mouth. Aurora blinked, and the boy became normal. A shudder passed through her very spirit.
Non.
She snapped, throwing her guitar into its case. As she slammed the case closed, much of the money inside spilled out onto the unyielding stone, but she didn't even consider trying to retrieve it.
Oh, okay.
The mother said in polite confusion. The little boy moved defensively behind her leg as Aurora took off. Slinging the instrument over her shoulder, Aurora weaved her way amongst the crowds and descended the many stairs that led away from the church. She wheezed as she made it to the bottom and entered the maze of winding streets that led back down into the city proper. It seemed, however, that as she descended, the path she walked became eerily devoid of life. Aurora walked with haste amongst houses that looked like they had been pulled directly from the past into the present. The streetlights were few and far between. They cast peculiar shadows all around her and did little to illuminate her surroundings. As she took quick and nervous strides between seemingly deserted buildings, heading towards the lights below, she began to notice the dark liquid that ebbed its way out of the cracks and crevices. It flowed from between window panes and from minuscule spaces amid brickwork, collecting in the street and tracing lines between the paving stones. As Aurora made her way down, a gentle trickle began to build, the burbling sound increasing in intensity until it resembled a distant roar. It reminded her of a noise she'd heard long ago, when her father told her that if she held a shell up to her ear, she would be able to hear the sea from inside. As the water began to collect around Aurora's feet, she could swear that something menacing lurked within it. It was an overwhelming and entirely irrational sensation of certainty, one that managed to completely grip her. She struggled to maintain a grasp on rationality, right up until something formless and rotten reached out from beneath her feet and tried to take a hold. Immediately she took off running, each footfall sending an icy spray billowing up around her. Behind, the distant ocean sound became deafening and morphed into an ear-shattering screech. Aurora could sense the presence that stalked her as something gave chase. She could almost taste its breath in the air, and it reeked of decay. As the girl with the guitarist's chest burned with exertion, she could not bring herself to steal a glance over her shoulder, sure that to look upon what followed could lead only to madness. As every breath became shallow and fatigue threatened to betray her, she came to a sudden stop when a figure lurched from an alleyway and into her path. Aurora collided with the silhouette, and both she and the stranger tumbled. The man let out a short grunt and winced as he caressed the elbow that had bore the brunt of the fall.
Je suis de mademoiselle désolé. Êtes-vous d'accord?
The middle-aged man asked respectfully, still slumped on the ground. Aurora looked up at the distant church, looming high above in the gloomy night. The street she had just ran down seemed impeccably ordinary. Without answering the stranger, she scrambled to her feet and made for home. Another long and restless night plagued the lady who sat forlornly in her apartment, until the sun arose once more. The leaky ceiling continued its endless rhythm, one drop at a time, and when morning did come and Aurora left for work, she could still hear that maddening beat. The cafe was packed and anarchic once again, and it was all the waitress could do to stay on her feet. Tension grew, and the ever-increasing weariness became intolerable. Worse yet, the same ruddy-faced baby returned, squawking incessantly. Even after it and the insufferable creature it spawned from had left the establishment, the baby's cries still lingered in her mind.
piling on top of the galling clang that looped endlessly. This stuck with her for hours on end. It made keeping track of orders impossible, left her unable to focus when she tried to busk for extra cash, and drowned out the talk of all those around her. On edge, and begging under her breath for a brief reprieve, she dug her nails into her palms, deep enough to break the skin. What leaked free felt warm upon her frozen hands, and as she made her way up the stairs back to her apartment on the 10th floor, she forced them a little deeper into her flesh. Aurora left the stairwell and entered the hallway that led to her cramped home. The moment the exit behind her had closed, a loud creak above made the building itself quake, and with a heavy thud, something in the ceiling gave way. Water began to pour, running down the walls. As it trickled over the doorways, they too became liquid and were washed away. What replaced them was featureless, slick and cream-colored, coated in thick and disgusting grime. Aurora turned to look for a way out that no longer was. She slammed stinging hands against where the passage to the stairs had once been, only managing to mix blood with dirt. As the hall began to fill, cold liquid crept higher. It had already reached her knees when she finally gave up furiously striking at the unbreakable barrier, and dashed down toward where her apartment door should have been. When she reached it, it had been replaced by heavy rusted iron. Upon it was a circular handle. She tried to turn it, but it fought her every step of the way. Aurora abandoned her guitar and doubled her efforts. Friction created fire in her hands as the wheel finally began to turn. She clenched her jaw and cursed loudly under the strain as the water reached her waist. With a final Herculean effort, the handle spun and the rusty door fell open, sending her tumbling into her apartment, followed by a torrent of fluid. Soaked, the woman hauled herself back onto her feet, but before she could even gain her bearings, the damp spot on the ceiling collapsed. From it fell a vile and misshapen mass, congealed matter that spread upon the wet ground, and then seemed to flow and contort as though it were alive. Damp hair clung to her face, framing her scream as the creature began to morph. Disturbing, twisted limbs formed from its core, and distorted approximations of human faces rose and fell, wailing in endless agony. The beat in her head, and the infinite cries to the screeching child that she could not seem to escape clashed with a deafening monstrosity, creating an unbearable maelstrom of noise.
Je veux la faire cesser. S'il vous plaît, juste l'arrête crier.
Aurora screeched, falling to her knees. The monster crept closer. Its decaying appendages in constant motion reached out towards her.
Laissez-moi tranquille.
She yelled against the unstoppable sound, covering her ears but finding no relief. Hurriedly she leapt to her feet and dove for the window as the already enormous thing expanded, blocking off any escape. As she fumbled with the window's latch, she looked back into the innumerable eyes of the being that cried out. Around them both, her apartment had begun to shift into a different state, and she realized she had to act fast. Forcing open the window, Aurora looked down into the street beneath. What was once a paved road had become a still and reflective surface. The height of the fall made her stomach turn, but she would do anything to escape the agonizing racket and the hideous monstrosity. Taking in a deep, final breath, the woman leapt out into the open space. Vicious winds whipped at her as she fell, and the endless clamor seemed to persist, even as she hurtled further and further from the hideous beast. Aurora's body pierced the shimmering street, and as she sank beneath it, a beautiful silence fell. In that first instance, she felt her entire body relax, and all the stress seemed to dissipate. Immediately something took a hold of her legs, wrapping around them and trying to pull her deeper. Instant panic caused her lungs to fill with cold fluid. Aurora struggled desperately against what lurked under her, but could not match its size or strength. It effortlessly clung to the thrashing woman, whose heart and mind raced uncontrollably. Suddenly, her situation ceased to matter. An all-embracing sense of euphoria washed over the one who was submerged. Her attempts to fight back were done, and her expression became serene. Hazy blue eyes stared up at the rippling sky, but they saw little as she was drawn into the dark below.
Break. Grayson Ward scanned through the countless news articles, laptop open on the dining room table. Despite the Bureau's best efforts to stem the tide of information about the mysterious murders, details of the rising body count were constantly being leaked to the press. The nation was gripped by fear, and speculation about how and why the victims continued to pile up was rampant. Many thought that it had to be a combined effort by a large criminal organization, since info pertaining to the prison case had ebbed out into the world. There was even speculation suggesting that the killings were a vigilante effort. Ward knew better than this, though. The number of innocent victims far outweighed the 7 dead who were recognized to be criminals. There were even accusations being thrown towards the FBI themselves, with conspiracy theorists believing that government agencies were to blame. They thought that the powers that be could be killing with an aim to scare the American people into quiet, fearful obedience. And some even argued that there were no real victims at all. Those who suggested such were under the impression that the Bureau was some kind of malevolent entity, rather than a collection of individuals who all share in humanity's universal ineptitude. Truth be told, the men and women assigned to catch the ones responsible had done nothing but chase their tails since the brutal slaughter had begun.
Morning, Daddy.
Grayson's daughter Brianna bounced energetically into the room.
Want to watch cartoons before I go?
Well, heck yeah, I do. He smiled, slamming the laptop closed.
Bree, first thing should be breakfast, you little monster.
Her mom yelled from the living room in good humor.
All right, fine.
The little one rolled her eyes. Grayson smirked at his daughter's skewed priorities and understood them more than he cared to admit. Do you want the fruity ones or the chocolate ones today? He asked her dotingly.
Fruity,
she said after a thoughtful squint. Good call. The off-duty agent quickly poured the blindingly bright cereal into a bowl and then prepared a second helping for himself. He added a splash of cold milk, handed one to Brianna, and then trailed behind her into the living room. They both sat on the carpet with crossed legs, as an animated show almost as colorful as their breakfast played out before them.
Oh geez, you are the worst influence,
Charlotte said on the couch behind them, and rolled her eyes at her husband. I love you, honey, he warbled in response, through a mouthful of sugar. They sat together for a short while, eating and enjoying the irrational antics of the anthropomorphized animals. Truth be told, Grayson genuinely adored the kid shows. His work was so devoid of joy, so marred in misery and suffering, that he couldn't stand entertainment that followed suit. He'd take a cartoon over a crime drama every time. They held a whimsical innocence that his daily life was almost completely lacking. Before the bow-tie-wearing cat could settle his differences with the brutish dog, however, his phone chimed in to spoil the fun. Ward, he answered, as he always did. We've got a new development. We need you at HQ as soon as possible for a briefing, Agent Martinez announced abruptly. Grayson could only sigh. All right, I'll be right over. He ended the call. They need me to come in early.
They are working you to death over there.
Charlotte furrowed her brow with concern. You're not wrong. This case is huge, though, and every day it carries on, people get a little more afraid, and our guys get a little more impatient, Grayson said, raising to his feet and mentally preparing to be the suited professional again. Their daughter was too enraptured with the television to absorb their conversation.
I know, but it terrifies me every time you leave for work. Do what needs to be done. I understand it's your job, but please, be safe,
she said gently, planting a kiss on her partner's cheek. So far, we've always been too late to be in any danger. I guess it might be a blessing in a way. Grayson breathed.
Is it selfish of me to hope it stays that way?
Charlotte snickered, but there was no pleasure in her laugh. Her husband merely smirked and gently kissed her forehead.
All right, Bree, time for school. Run a brush through your hair and we'll go,
the mother stated in a most motherly way.
It's fine,
Brianna huffed, trying to run a hand through her tangled curls. Come on now. Your mom knows best. Grayson attempted to add some authority to his words,
but it just wasn't in him to do so.
I've got this. You go ahead and play the hero.
His wife shooed him playfully.
I had a feeling you wouldn't want to cooperate.
Agent Ward's voice poured from the speaker as he and the other investigators reviewed the recording of his discussion with the prison survivor. He recalled his bitterness. It was definitely evident in his tone.
What, because you're black, right?
The skinhead had sneered at him.
You really think I give a shit about that? Look, in here you pick a side or you don't survive. It's kind of a rule. We have a few of them. And the first is that no one talks to the feds.
The inmate was known as Marco and was plastered with crude neo-Nazi tattoos.
This is bigger than your prison politics. The safety of many hinges on our investigation, yours included.
He had explained, remaining collected.
Well, forgive me for being self-centered, but I don't see how it could get any worse for me. Everyone else could fucking rot.
Marco bared cracked teeth.
I'm not asking you to sympathize with anyone. I'm asking you to tell me what you know. We can help make your life here more tolerable, if you help us.
Grayson said, and the convict snorted derisively.
What the hell can you do for me? We can get you out of solitary.
The agent had offered.
And why would I want that? This is the sweetest place to be.
The con laughed.
Then we can get you better food, more time in the recreation yard. Now you're talking my language. I'll take both. And I tell you what, if I can stay here for good, I'll tell you everything. I've kind of grown to like this place, and I'm sick of rubbing elbows with the scum.
Marco sneered.
Speak, and this cell is yours.
Ward nodded.
You're gonna be disappointed.
The gaunt prisoner's eyes had lit up with glee.
We'll see. Well, I heard something going down, like a struggle. I guess it was just the screws giving one of the other jailbirds a beating. Figured my turn was on its way. Happened a few times. Seemed a lot faster than usual, though. They all squealed like stuck pigs. Then, it got awful quiet.
Marco's stare through the slot in the door never wavered.
And that's it?
Agent Ward pursed his lips in irritation.
Mostly. After their wailing stopped, I could hear someone breathing, heavy-like. Then it was as if someone was talking, whispering in the box next door. I couldn't make out what they was saying, though. The last thing I heard was some kind of gross, wet sound. I don't really know how to explain it to you.
His gruff voice was a little distorted on the audio recording, but Grayson remembered its gravelly tenor very well. The airwaves were clear for a moment, as Agent Ward had stood, maintaining eye contact with Marco as he analyzed the information he was fed. After a few seconds of consideration, he had a final question.
You said it was fast. How long was there in between struggles? Oh, no time at all. Didn't even hear a key in the lock. They just screamed one after the next.
The convict smirked menacingly.
So what happened out there? All of your neighbors are dead.
The audio playback ended. So far, this is all we have to show for our investigation. A pile of bodies, a partial print, and some freaking whispers. Martinez, head of the investigation, addressed the room. The lines of crow's feet deepened, speaking of his experience. This shit just keeps getting worse. We're constantly finding new victims, and we're certain there are plenty who are unaccounted for. Yeah, worse is right. We're chasing murderous zombies who can walk through fucking walls. Agent Fuller spat sarcastically, and a few suits laughed. Grayson leafed through his case notes as the presentation went on, scanning the endless grinning corpses. He took in their varied locations, briefly glancing at a teenage boy from the first wave, who, like many others, was missing and presumed dead. Well, this morning we may finally have our break, the lead agent continued, ignoring his colleague's inappropriate interjection. We have 2 simultaneous cases, which gives credence to the theory that we're dealing with multiple killers here. Martinez tapped at a few keys, and the projection on the wall displayed 3 photographs. The first 2 showed 3 deceased males, all dressed in security uniforms, and the second showed a single female victim. The first incident appears to have happened sometime last night. As you can see, they all fit the standard MO. They were overnight watchmen at a parking lot, and again we have evidence of cannibalism here. The second, we're told, happened at 6 a.m. today, hundreds of miles away from those guys, and unusually there's only 1 body. He hammered away at his laptop again, and a picture of a man appeared. The best part, this guy claims to be our first witness. Agent Ward perked up at the mention of a potential lead. He glanced up from his file and recognized the visage projected on the wall. I've spoken to him before. He's a teacher. We talked to him about potential leads after the first wave of murders. Grayson could not look away, as the excitement at a chance to finally make a breakthrough swelled up within him. That's right, Ward. You and Fuller are booked on the first flight out of here, so both of you get your shit together. You're going back to where this all began.
The Leatherman. Some on this planet are content, satisfied with their lot and able to sit idly by, static whilst all else is in motion. Others are not quite so inclined to remain in place. They seek out a calling or a cause, something to fight for, a goal to achieve, a purpose they create for themselves. One such man is Walter Kappa, a former investigative journalist who traveled far and wide as a result of his occupation. Walter has covered conflict and rebellion. His journey is a whirlwind of blood and betrayal, corruption and violence. Stoically speaking to a lens as gunshots split the air mere feet away can have a certain effect on a human being, and after many years wandering war-torn countries, the journalist became numb. Watching the lifeless husks of innocent youths being carelessly dragged from the rubble should never become routine. But that is exactly what death and destruction became to him. Just another day at the office. When this fact dawned on Walter, he could not shake the feeling that in some way his very humanity was eroding. He was growing ever more callous and heartless. As a result, he decided that it was time to bid farewell to his former profession and enter what he felt was a well-earned early retirement. It wasn't long, though, before the novelty of unlimited leisure time started to grate on the nerves of this former globetrotter. He found himself drawn back towards the dark world he had left behind. At times, this made him uneasy, as the magnetic attraction he felt when he faced both the bloody and the bleak should probably be a cause for concern, he thought. However, that feeling seemed to disappear within a few blurry frames as he perched on his comfortable chair, peering closely at the shattering skull of a Syrian rebel. Walter spent his twilight hours, face pale in front of a glowing monitor, guiltily savoring all the depravity the vast wastes of the internet had to offer. He stumbled across stories of strange disappearances. Soon he was adrift in a world of abstract fantasy, immersed in an ethereal place where fact and fiction blur, until neither are truly independent. Swiftly, sitting behind the screen was no longer enough. Walter once again became a moving piece on the board, actively seeking out the truth behind the virtual whispers. The miles swept by beneath him as he took to the skies again. There were no longer cameras, but there was a motivation far more personal than a paycheck, for he had rediscovered the thrill of the chase. The thought of uncovering a shadowy truth behind mysterious circumstances exhilarated him to no end. But alas, he was always seemingly one step behind his imperceptible targets. Disappointed, he waited in Glasgow airport. His excursion to the Scottish moors had ended with a derelict manner and a wall of silence. He hit the keys hard in irritation as he researched his next objective. A village in Europe that had suddenly gone silent. No one who traveled there ever returned, or so the rumors stated. This time it was a story whose origins were far closer to home than he was accustomed to. Walt wasn't holding his breath, though. A secluded settlement is a prime breeding ground for wild speculation and internet nonsense. The perfect starting point for bored 13-year-olds who live to weave woeful tales and watch as 1,000 gullible fools scramble to furiously Google search their way to wisdom.
So it was with a sigh that Walter Kappa, investigative journalist turned full-time bullshit inspector, trundled along heading heavenward amongst mountainous terrain. His rental car reeked of stale smoke, with a hint of pine scent from the swinging two-dimensional tree that seemed intent on obscuring his view of the precarious trail. The fleeing sun made him cautious of his speed, as there were no lights to speak of, aside from the pitiable ones attached to his vehicle. A long drive off a short cliff didn't seem overly appealing. A second sigh escaped his lips when the near invisible track widened, but this time it was one of relief. He came to a steady halt at the base of a tall gate. Ornate swirls of cast black iron twisted towards the sparkling stars, and the spikes at its peak were aimed at the moon. He couldn't see much of the mysterious village, barely lit as it was by ancient-looking gas lanterns off in the distance. What he could see, however, was a small girl sat on cobbled stones next to a lantern of her own, back facing toward him. She played idly with a battered-looking rag doll, paying him no mind. Walter attempted to open the gate, in spite of the chains wrapped around its metalwork. The clattering links startled the girl. She turned, glancing at him with pale blue eyes, and then returned to fiddling with her doll. Looking to his left and right, he saw a sheer drop and a tall cliff face respectively. With limited options, he tried the gate again. This time the girl didn't even grant him a glance.
"Excuse me,"
Walter said, irritated.
"Aren't you going to let me inside?"
His hands wrapped around frosty spirals. The girl stood, looking up at him, her features lacking expression.
Are you sure you want to come in here?
She asked, as though reading lines from a script she didn't care for. This left Walter bemused, as he wondered who might leave a little girl outside alone so late at night.
Yeah, of course I'm sure,"
he replied, waving his hand dismissively. She remained silent, maintaining eye contact with him throughout a long and awkward pause.
You're absolutely certain?
"I told you. Yeah, I want in."
Walter spoke again, this time a little more irately.
Last chance to turn back, mister.
The child spoke quickly.
"Just open the damn gate, kid,"
he said with a tone of finality. In silence she approached the heavy heart-shaped lock that held the chains in place. And then the child proceeded to pull a large rusty key from inside her wine-red dress. It was draped around her neck on a tired-looking string. With a dull clunk, the lock was released, and the aging gate creaked open. Walter stepped onto the uneven stone ground, and while he still doubted the oddball online rumors about the village, he was forced to admit to himself that a strange atmosphere did indeed drench the place. It was unnaturally quiet. With a soft rattle, the child replaced the lock.
"Just who are you trying to keep out of here anyway?"
Walter asked, observing the fence preventing any entrance to the isolated plateau on which the village stood.
I'm not keeping anyone out, mister,
she told him, concealing the key.
"Well, you could have fooled me,"
he muttered. The girl retrieved her tatty rag doll and began to stroll away.
"Hey, aren't you supposed to watch the gate or something?"
Nah, I don't feel like it anymore.
She replied casually without looking back, doll in tow.
"Wait, kid, what's with this place? Where is everyone?"
They're around, mister.
The child stated, skipping towards the shadowy buildings.
"Would you just wait up?"
Walt pleaded, setting off to follow her. After all, she was the closest thing to a lead he had, as there wasn't another soul in sight. Their footsteps resounded through the cold night. Curtains twitched in the lead-framed windows around them, revealing for brief instances fragments of ghostly faces. Elongated shadows danced just beyond the reach of yielding light, and each building looked distinct and handcrafted. In an ever-changing glow, the solid structures appeared fluid in nature, pliable in a way Walter knew they could never be. The girl came to a halt at a gothic-looking water fountain. The twisted forms of watchful gargoyles stood guard over the village's central plaza. Water with a green hue spewed in a shimmering torrent from between their bared teeth, cascading downwards, creating bubbles where they fell. She sat on the dampened edge of the grotesque-looking fountain and kicked her feet playfully back and forth. Walter's eyes shot from window to window, greeted by bright glares from darkened rooms. He breathed that same old sigh, briefly considering approaching the homes of the reclusive residents and requesting an explanation. The old-timer was less than adept at speaking to kids. The ex-journalist walked towards a residence completely encased in winding ivy, and knocked heavily on the door with his calloused knuckles.
They won't speak to you, you know.
The increasingly irritating kid called to him, wishing that he had never had the urge to leave the familiar gloom in which he existed at home.
Well, will you?
He shouted back, arms outstretched. Walt's withering eyes could barely make out tiny shoulders shrugging. Head lowered in exasperation, he made his way back to the fountain, realizing the situation might require a slightly more personable approach than he was accustomed to. Reaching the enigmatic child, he dropped down low to be at her eye level.
Look, let's start over. You don't have to call me mister. My name is Walter. I've heard strange things about this place. I'm hoping to find out what, if anything, is going on here. I'm thinking maybe you can help me. What's your name, kid?
Walt did his best to sound earnest, but he had no idea if he succeeded.
They call me Hope around here, Mr. Walter. I'm sorry, but I don't think anything can help you now.
Hope peered up at him through hair as dark as the night sky, shaking her head as she talked.
Hope, huh? Cute name.
He grumbled.
Nothing can help me now. What do you mean?
Because he won't let you leave. He doesn't let anybody leave,
Hope said. Had either of them looked at the ivy-covered house, they would have seen the door open just a fraction and witnessed gaunt fingers creeping over its rugged oak surface. Walt's gaze narrowed in bewilderment.
Who would want to stop anybody from leaving?
The retired reporter asked.
It's the Leatherman. He keeps everyone inside this place.
Hope hopped off the wall and scuffed her delicate-looking shoe across the ground, looking sullen. Even Walter's well-traveled mind didn't know what to make of this. He wondered who would have a motive to keep everyone trapped in such a manner, and how it was even possible to do so. The village was like a ghost town, and all that seemed to stand between the residents and freedom was a small child and a locked gate. It didn't seem to make any sense.
Do you know where I can find this Leatherman?
He inquired in a gruff tenor of a man who had seen far too much in his time.
He's up there.
Hope pointed to the peak of a clock tower at the end of a winding street. Diffused light passed through the tower's weathered face. A large arched window stood open in parallel, and an ancient-looking bell hung above.
He never comes out.
Walter scratched idly at the stubble on his chin, curious how a man who never ventured outside could have such power over people, if any of what the kid said was true. Before he could ask anything further, the gentle patter of the fountain's murky waters became lost beneath a female voice crying out,
Joshka, no!
A woman screeched all too late. Hope was thrown off her feet as the man known as Joshka struck her. The rag doll was sent spiraling into the bubbling fountain. The little girl collapsed to the frosty stones, and the key around her neck was swiftly snatched away. The instant the key had fallen into Joshka's grasp, the gargantuan bell at the tower summit began to toll. He sprinted towards the gate, his ragged clothing flapping in the breeze. An ominous rattle filled the sky, the sound of a million fluttering wings. A hideous murky mass appeared from the window of the clock tower, spilling forth with a liquid fluidity. The writhing cloud passed overhead, and the starry sky was lost. Those below were left in shadow.
No, someone please, help me!
They hardly heard Joshka's pleas over the vociferous swarm. An army of colossal moths enveloped him. They descended with furious speed, and in such great numbers that nothing could be seen beyond their shifting veil. It was over as quickly as it had begun. Starlight returned, but not a trace of Joshka remained. The key lay solitary on the ground. Walter approached Hope and helped her to her feet, as a heavy unease settled in the pit of his gut. Something really was awry in that strange, God-forsaken place. All was soundless, aside from the cauldron-like churning of the grim, green liquid, and the weeping woman in the doorway of her ivy-ridden home. She clutched a baby, holding it close to her chest, as she sobbed hysterically. Walter looked on with indifference, then turned his attention back to the young girl. "Are you okay?" Tears tore streaks in the dirt on her face, but she refused to make a sound. Hope strode to retrieve her pendant of burden. Internally, Walt struggled, attempting to piece together meaningful words. Before he had the chance to settle on some semblance of soothing syllables, she spoke first.
"Where is Anna?"
Hope peered around with searching eyes. "Anna?"
"My doll, Anna, where is she?"
she asked with a parent's concern. Walter glanced to the fountain, seeing the rag doll's rippling silhouette, obscured beneath the water's surface. He pointed with a gray, aged finger.
"Oh no,"
she groaned, clambering over the wall with a splash. Waist deep, she plodded forwards, wading her way through. The child became almost fully submerged as she snatched up her prized possession, her delicate features reflected by a murky mirror in motion. She held Anna close, appearing much like the weeping mother who was still lost in her own personal hell.
"I need to take better care of her,"
she told Walter as she graciously climbed back onto dry land. "Why is it so important to you?" A world-weary wanderer with no fraction of innocence remaining could never truly understand.
"She's important because she is my friend, Mr. Walter,"
Hope said in a matter-of-fact manner, squeezing the doll to drain the putrid liquid from its fabric body.
"Anna's the only one who speaks to me. She's the only one who can leave here, and she doesn't have to carry any dumb old key around. Anna tells me about the world outside this place."
The child stared at the damp doll intently, a slight frown twisting her lips. Kappa's mind only latched on to a singular point. "So if I tried to leave here, those things would attack me too?" Hope nodded in response to his question, beginning to shiver in her sodden red dress. The old man groaned. He had just witnessed something truly bizarre. Something that, even in his most hazardous of occupations, he had never come across before. He realized his choices were limited. It was either continue his search for the truth, or join the pathetic spectral figures that inhabited that village of the damned forevermore. Not much of a choice at all. "How can I meet this leather man?"
"There's only one way to meet him,"
Hope said apprehensively. "What is it?"
"I don't want you to get hurt, mister,"
she said anxiously, shaking her head. "Don't worry about me. Trust me. I'll have seen worse than whatever this freak has to offer," Walt assured her. He had been through hell and back, seen and heard things most couldn't begin to imagine. Old Walter wasn't afraid of anything anymore.
"You're brave, mister. If you're sure, then you'll have to take this."
Hope hesitated for a moment, then removed the key from her neck and held it in an outstretched hand.
"But you have to promise me that you will come back."
Walt faltered for a second. If he took it, it was a pretty safe bet that those things would come for him, but he had no idea what would happen next. Still, curiosity beckoned, its allure too strong to resist. He reached forward to retrieve the key, but the child recoiled.
"Promise me and cross your heart."
Her eyes narrowed warily. "Okay. I promise I'll come back." He made a crossing motion over his heart, and then she finally allowed him to take the key. As the bell began to toll again, a pang of fear struck him in a way it hadn't in many years. Hope stepped back, and Walter clutched the key tightly, as the sound of fluttering wings took the night once more.
He found it difficult to defy his instinct to flee, but he stood his ground as the countless creatures whirled around him. Walt dropped the key and shielded himself as best he could against their onslaught. Their number was so overwhelming that his world became nothing but that dreadful cloud of insects. The inquisitive man could not see the hands that grabbed him and dragged him free of the earth. The child watched reluctantly as her new friend was taken away. She squeezed her drenched doll tightly and spoke softly to herself.
Remember your promise, mister.
Walter hit the soft carpet to a symphony of scattering moths. They spread erratically, glowed red-hot, and burned to cinders in the air. From his face-down position, he heard the telltale sound of feet meeting metal, an unknown entity escaping up into the space where the vast bell hung. The rhythmic tick of the huge clock accompanied its own rapid breathing, that of another, and the nauseating sound of teeth meeting flesh.
A pleasure to meet you.
A voice came, one which sounded like many speaking in unison. A booming, malevolent chuckle seemed to shake the room itself.
Help me!
Walter turned to see what remained of Joshka reaching out towards him, scarcely recognizable, now less than human. He was mutilated beyond a point Walter had ever thought possible to survive. The jaded ex-journalist ascended to his knees. He was at the center of a dim, gas-lit room. Ahead of him stood an antique ebony desk, inset with complex carvings. Blood wound its way down through the intricate patterns, staining the decorative rug beneath. What sat in the throne-like seat behind it chilled him to his bones.
"You're the Leatherman?"
Walter asked, shock abound. A short, twisted bark of laughter left the monster's jaws.
Is that what that little bitch is calling me?
He grinned with a row of long, needle-like teeth.
I'll be sure to thank her for that.
With a decaying black tongue, he licked at the blood on his palm.
What the hell are you?
Walt virtually choked on his own words.
Me? I am something beyond your comprehension. A being who perfectly personifies how weak and pathetic your fragile race truly is.
The Leatherman's many voices spoke with disdain, and he proceeded to take a hold of the pile of pulpy tissue placed in front of him, sinking savage points deep into the silky mass. Walter looked on with disgust. The monstrosity he faced was vaguely human in shape, but its skin was coarse and dark, rising in jagged peaks. The Leatherman dropped the gory heap back onto the desk, having devoured as much as he desired.
I don't understand,
Walter muttered.
I wouldn't expect you to, pig.
The creature spat his words, and flecks of red came soaring with them. What was left of Joshka writhed, pained on the ground. A ghastly gargling sound emanated from his clogged throat as he struggled to breathe.
Then enlighten me. Why trap the people here?
Walt spoke cautiously, hoping not to anger the beast. Its snake-like nostrils flared.
It is a small part of something greater, something which you not have the pleasure of bearing witness to.
A frightening claw traced lines on the scarlet desk, and soft tissue adhered to the terror's fingertip.
But why? Why are you doing this?
He gestured towards Joshka.
This man, I think he has a child. And the girl down there, why give her the key? Surely there's no reason for that.
Walter tried to maintain a calm, sensible tone, in spite of the insane circumstances. The Leatherman's wide diamond eyes set on Joshka, and another perverted chuckle broke free.
Never underestimate the importance of entertainment, my friend.
He smirked.
You're sick,
Walt said, failing to sound forceful.
Oh, how sweet of you to act like you care.
The horror twisted its head in mock sincerity.
That man will become more than you could ever hope to be, Kaiten. I tire of your presence.
The towering being began to crawl forwards. He slinked over the ghastly contents of the desk, hands crushing what remained of his meal. A broad, barbed tail rose menacingly at his back. Either side of his spine, scarred flesh arose, the remnants of wings that once were. The ex-reporter backed away, but escape was impossible. His eyes scoured the room and fell upon nothing but dusty antiques. Jaska clutched weakly at his leg for a moment and tried to speak with failing lungs. The leather man pounced, pinning Walter by the throat to a cluttered bookcase. With his feet far from the ground, the old-timer fought for breath, but it was hopeless. Steadily, the world became indistinct.
Perhaps.
The guttural voices sounded distant, as the formidable tail hovered right before Walter's open, streaming eye.
No, you are not worthy.
The monster took a single claw and pushed it deep into the retired journalist's throat. It ran a clean line across his feeble neck and watched the colors run free.
What a shame you won't be here to see how it all ends.
The leather man grinned. His words carried the stench of death. The monster looked satisfied as the life leaked from the human's open wound. When the shuddering finally ceased, it carried the lifeless husk to the open window and cast it out into the night. The clock ticked and talked as the corpse met the ground far below with a thud. A small girl, garbed in a wine-red dress, saw something lying in the street.
Mr. Walter?
The witness. Yeah, we're around the corner. We'll be outside the house in just a second. Agent Fuller yelled unnecessarily, making a right turn into the cul-de-sac where the latest killing had taken place. All right. Local forensics team are still analyzing their findings. They should be in touch with you shortly. Let me know if you get anything good out of the witness. Martinez ordered over the speakers, then immediately hung up. Well, goodbye to you too, Fuller smarmed. Grayson took a final leaf through the crime scene photographs, before placing them carefully back into their folder. Jesus Christ, look at these parasites, his partner said, raising a disapproving hand in the direction of the press. A manic rabble yelled and jostled each other outside of the unassuming house, brandishing microphones and cameras. Police in uniform demanded that they stay back and declined to comment when questions flew their way. The unmarked agency vehicle pulled up onto the curb and parked less than an inch away from the rear doors of a news van. Two agents stepped out and made their way towards the crowd.
Hey, excuse me, you're blocking our van.
A female reporter in a needlessly low-cut top complained. No comment. Fuller shooed her away, never breaking stride. He and Ward pushed through the crowd, as the officers demanded that the pressers make way. They ducked beneath the crime scene tape, quickly flashed their identification, and the cop on the door allowed them entry. The two feds passed into a dimly lit hallway and paced across a faded rug. Listen, you do the talking. I'm not as diplomatic as you are, Agent Fuller whispered, just before they stepped into a dank living room. The curtains were drawn, the only light source a stained lamp with floral details. Upon a musty couch, the witness sat next to a female officer. His head hung low, like a man defeated. Mr. Wexler, Ward began, but the man did not look up. My name is Grayson. I'm with the FBI. This is my partner, Agent Fuller, and we're here to ask you a few questions about what happened. We realize this may be a difficult time for you, but anything you can tell us, no matter how minor it may seem, could help us bring the perpetrator to justice. His tone was even, It was the controlled delivery of a professional who had read from a similar script on far too many occasions. Yeah, I remember you. I'll do what I can to help your investigation. Gareth Wexler murmured. He was an undernourished figure, whose eyes appeared large behind the square rim of his spectacles. A lank ponytail reached down to his waistline, and he was garbed in scruffy pajamas. We appreciate your cooperation. Grayson nodded. If you don't mind, I'd like to begin by having you recount the events that led up to your interaction with the suspect. Okay, sure. It was early in the morning. Still dark. I think it was a little after 5:30. I was down in the basement, working on a bird table. Carpentry is, kind of my hobby. And I like to work on stuff before class sometimes. It helps to wake my brain up, you know? He glanced up at Agent Ward, who toyed with his wedding ring as he listened dutifully to the teacher's testimony. After a short while, I headed back upstairs to grab breakfast before heading to work, and that's when I found her on the kitchen floor. Wexler paused thoughtfully. Whoever did it must have heard me coming, because when I walked in, I saw him disappear out of the back door. The teacher said, his stare firmly planted on his bare feet. Can you tell us what this guy looked like? Fuller interjected brashly. I'll tell you all I can, of course. Wexler squeezed his eyes shut. He was tall, maybe around 6'2", 6'3". It's hard to say exactly, but he had short black hair and darkish skin, like he might have been Middle Eastern or something. Do you remember anything about what he was wearing? Agent Fuller pressed. I think he had on tennis shoes, baggy pants, a gray hooded sweatshirt. That's all I can think of. The teacher placed his hands on his knees and exhaled forcefully. All right, so you found her, and the perpetrator ran. Then what happened? Grayson urged the witness to continue, whilst maintaining his collected disposition. I ran over to see if she was still breathing. Obviously, I recognized the wounds right away. The interviewee gestured towards his cheeks, then placed a hand over his mouth, seeming for a moment to be overwhelmed by the situation. When I couldn't get her to move, I called the ambulance and the cops as fast as I could. I stayed with her on the kitchen floor until they arrived. Since they took my wife away, I haven't left this room. That's understandable. This type of experience nothing could ever prepare you for. We have people who can help you cope with the shock, should you desire their assistance. Ward assured him. Is there any reason why someone might have targeted your wife? Wexler sat silently for a few seconds before responding. Because I talked to you, he finally whimpered. Grayson took stock of his thoughts. It could be true that someone involved might seek revenge on a person who had spoken to the authorities, and much had leaked to the public about the ongoing investigation into the now countless murders. However, there was no evidence to suggest that the identities of anyone interviewed had gotten out, and never before had there been an isolated killing linked to their investigation. For some reason, this one was personal. He was sure of it. Would you mind showing me where you do your carpentry? The agent requested. I guess I can. There's nothing much to see, but okay. The teacher replied. I'm going to take a look around, Fuller announced, and left the dingy living room without awaiting the homeowner's blessing. As Agent Fuller made his way around the premises, Grayson was led down wooden steps, into the chilly basement. When he and the teacher reached the bottom of the flight, he was greeted with a cramped, dusty space, workbenches with vices attached, half-finished projects, and innumerable tools were strewn around the perimeter. So, do you spend a lot of time down here? Grayson asked, conversationally, whilst absorbing as much of the environment as he could. Oh yeah, I find it therapeutic to work with my hands, I guess. Focusing on crafting something, really taking my time. It helps me to remain centered. Wexler said, his features practically expressionless. As he talked, Ward's analytical sweep of the workspace led his gaze to fall on a particular object, a small saw with a serrated edge that seemed to shine just a little brighter than the rest. Having briefly glanced around the kitchen, Fuller trusted that the forensics team would have found anything of worth in the room where the incident took place. He instead made his way upstairs, giving the officer still sat on the couch a quick, one-fingered salute as he passed the open doorway. Once on the floor above, he made for the bedroom. Pulling on a pair of latex gloves, the agent began rooting through drawers, checking beneath the bed, anywhere that could potentially turn up some fresh evidence. As he searched, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Fuller checked the email he had received. It was Martinez informing him that someone on the team had contacted Wexler's service provider and discovered that Mrs. Wexler was making frequent calls to a Mr. Carson in the weeks prior to her death. This set his mind into action. He tried to think of where a wife might hide something that she did not want her husband to find. Almost immediately, his critical observation was drawn to a red jewelry box that stood on the nightstand. Fuller paced over to it, his exorbitantly priced shoes creaking under his weight. Gently, he opened the lid. There were a bunch of inexpensive pieces inside, and a single pair of earrings that looked to be worth more than the rest combined. He lifted the tray that sat within, but nothing was tucked away beneath it. The drawer at the bottom of the box, however, had a small keyhole on its face. Fuller picked up the prospective source of evidence and glanced around to check the coast was clear. Whoops. Shoulders beneath a finely tailored jacket shrugged, and he threw the box to the ground. It broke easily, sending small pieces of debris in every direction. Fuller crouched low, shifting the shattered wood aside, and discovered a small pile of letters. Each one was signed with the same moniker, C. Looks like our teacher might just have a motive after all. Fuller spoke to the empty bedroom in a smug tone. Then his phone vibrated again. This time it was a call. "Hello," he answered, somewhat self-satisfied.
Agent Fuller?
The unfamiliar voice asked. Speaking.
I was told to report to you. We've found some inconsistencies with the usual MO.
Well, you don't say. The agent smirked. As Grayson's suspicions grew, he felt the comforting weight of the gun holstered beneath his clothing, and was grateful to be carrying it. The gloomy basement had begun to seem a little less safe. This one here. He pointed to the saw that was more knife-like than one might expect, although instead of a single clean edge, it had pointed teeth that crossed each other. What's this for? That one? The weed of a man hesitated nervously. It's just for making rough cuts, that I can then refine with more precise tools. Have you cleaned it recently? Ward kept his eye on the possible murder weapon, but paid close attention to the figure in his peripheral vision. Well, I try to clean all of my... Wexler's sentence came to an immediate halt, as out of nowhere a large kitchen knife pierced his throat. He collapsed onto the concrete, and before Grayson had a chance to react, something leapt and tackled him to the ground with impossible strength. A razor-sharp edge sliced through his cheek, opening his mouth from lip to jawbone. The agent cried out and tried to reach for his gun, but the weapon's sharp point was promptly driven through his arm, pinning him to the floor. The pale form that crouched on his chest, disheveled and in tattered clothes, held a cold expression. Thick red stitches ran in graceless crosses over the boy's hideous grin. Malodorous breath seeped from the spaces between the string, and his terrible eyes did not look human. They appeared more like dark ink swirling through fluid in motion. It was only when taking in the whole that recognition came to Grayson Ward. He had seen this youth before.
Miles.
Ward spoke, and a gaze that seemed to be looking through him before appeared to gain a little focus.
Miles, why are you doing this?
He whimpered. The teenager called Miles, who was a suspected victim of the first wave, cocked his head in a curious manner. For a moment, He seemed to ponder, slowly processing the question.
"We need their colors,"
he whispered, then yanked the knife from the agent's arm, and in an instant seemed to be consumed by shadows. With that, the boy was gone, and the bleeding investigator could not believe what he had seen. It was unreasonable. It could not have been, and yet he had just witnessed it for himself. Grayson twisted his body, curling up into a ball and cradling his punctured limb. The flesh that had been cut loose upon his face felt alien, succumbing to gravity in a sensation most bizarre. Fuller dashed down into the basement, gun drawn.
"Jesus Christ! What happened?"
he asked in a state nearing anger, as he took in the horrifying scene.
"The boy,"
his partner muttered with a vacant stare, and sawdust scattered on his breath.
"It's the boy."
Abyss Walker. A frail body, bound in tattered clothes, lay heavy in a black and motionless sea. The darkness, though cold, took its weight gently, relieving aching muscle and weary bone. Nearby, a hooded figure stood ever watchful. The child's consciousness drifted, caught in a state not unlike the limbo between the waking world and the realm of dreams. He allowed himself to descend, embracing the boundless, beautiful silence. All pain seemed to dissipate. Quickly his mind shed the chaotic color and the sound that shrieked and spun within, until there was nothing left. A wondrous sense of peace washed over him. All was bliss, until suddenly an unfamiliar presence stirred. The boy sat and stared out into the void. He climbed to his feet and looked to his hooded companion, hoping for guidance. And as the weary child peered towards their point of origin, though he could see nothing, he felt certain that something peered back. Silence fell, and he edged his way closer to his gaunt, grinning friend, until he was close enough to find some comfort. They stood together unmoving, listening. After a short and agonizing quiet, the noise began anew. A disconcerting din, not unlike that of soft flesh drawn across coarse stone. Gradually it faded, until it was gone entirely, and yet the boy could not tear his eyes away. An unfamiliar feeling gripped him, a primal sensation that seemed to echo something buried deep within his fractured mind. For the first time since he had embraced the abyss, the boy was afraid.